1 minute.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, events, and more across our country as well as across the surface of our divided globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, I hope everybody's morning is going well. Let's get into the headlines. First up, in COVID news, at least 1,425 new coronavirus deaths and 56,672 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 67,470 cases per day. That's a decrease of 21% from the average 2 weeks earlier. And as of this morning, more than 28,679,600 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, while over 514,000 have died from it. CDC Director Rochelle Walensky warned states on Monday that now is not the time to lift public health restrictions. This comes as recent statistics show decline in coronavirus cases and deaths. In a press briefing, Walensky said, quote, "With these new statistics, I'm really worried about reports that more states are rolling back the exact public health measures we have recommended to protect people from COVID-19, end quote. That is the yo-yo effect that we've been going through in a sort of larger way for the past year at this point. Of course, cold and flu season hit, people locked down, states locked down, and it got real bad there for a time. And now we're starting to recover from it. And of course, his point is taken. The moment that things get better, people are like, wait, can I peek my head out the house again? Can I reverse this lockdown again, whether you're a governor or you're just a random citizen? And at the exact moment when you want to do that the most, it also probably makes sense to do it the least, because then you're going to get a spike back up. And instead of, beating down the fire in the long run, instead of severely limiting the spread, basically creating green zones. I mean, if you can imagine, I saw a good breakdown of this recently. If you can imagine if early on in the crisis, this might sound crazy, but you had even more drastic lockdowns to the point where instead of limiting the spread in a city, in many major cities across the country, you completely cut it off. There was zero circulation, there was zero community spread, kind of like we saw in Wuhan. You could create like green zones where, for travel into those green zones is a little bit more moderated. You have to have a quarantining period when you're traveling long distances across the country. I know that sounds onerous in its own way, but you could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives, and you could have had whole cities that travel within those cities is basically completely open because you have a safe area, if that makes sense. I don't know, Jamarl, that might seem radical, but that's the sort of natural extension of those kinds of policies. What do you think?
No, I understand where you're coming from. I guess her thing is, how do we keep people safe? And what is the way of opening the economy up? Because there's two competing priorities at this point. This is not entirely just a medical decision. It's also a political decision. When do you open up? When do you get to the point where you could say, all right, keeping people pinned in is more detrimental or more deleterious as opposed to opening it up this point. And by the way, that's going to take place whether we want to or not. The more people that get inoculated, the more people that are going to chafe at being stuck in the house. Like I said before, it's one thing when everybody's ill or when there's the potential for everybody to get sick. Then fair enough. You're going to get 60, 70% of people saying, yeah, I'm staying at home. I'm perfectly okay with this. This is a great strategy. But the moment that you get, let's say, 50% of people inoculated, they're not going to want to stay in the house. And you're going to get a lot of pushback on policies like this that try to force them to do so. So mark my words, I strongly suspect that that's what's going to turn out. Yeah, there's something to be said about opening up too early that could basically increase the spread again, which is something you don't necessarily want to do. Look, I don't know.
It's politically and culturally unpalatable.
Right. Yeah, it is. And the catch becomes, what's the middle ground? Like, what's the area where a politician says, look, we're not going to get rid of all the cases. We just need to make sure the cases don't spike. We got to open up the economy because keeping it closed at this point, with this number of people inoculated, with this much of the public against it, you have to accept a certain amount of losses. Like, this is not 5,000 people dying a day. You know what I mean? So at some point, that question has to come into play. And I would wager that question is coming into play right now as all these people get inoculated and as the numbers go down. So they are probably going to be looking for ways. How do we open this up? How do we open this up? And, you know, you might have scientists saying, wait, but the scientists are going to hold far less weight as this goes along. And this has become more of a political choice of opening it up. That's my
problem is
choice.
Any measure that's severe enough to dramatically curtail the course of this disease is also going to be seen as a tyrannical infringement on people's liberties, inevitably, whether it's like requiring that people wear masks, you know, in most cases across the board whenever they're indoors. That's one of the more mild requirements. But even that, of course, a lot of people are going to be like, wait, what are you trying to make me do here? Or requiring people to do contact tracing, hooking up to an app that will track you on your phone. I mean, I get why people say no, thank you. Or severe lockdowns where whether it's travel within cities or travel between cities, your ability to go to a restaurant or a movie theater. I mean, people have gone along with these things to various degrees. But of course, if you take them to a degree that you would need to take to cut the course of the disease down completely, I get it. People are cautious about that stuff, and particularly when it comes to the contact tracing thing, I'm pretty cautious about that too. But I'm just pointing out the alternatives here. We should get back to the headlines, though. In national political news, senior Democrats are abandoning a backup plan to increase the minimum wage through a corporate tax penalty. Economists and tax experts have said that the tax outlined by Sanders and Wyden could be easily avoided and difficult to implement. This is, by the way, the tax that would be imposed as an alternative to a raise on a $15 minimum wage, basically taxing companies who pay lower than that wage. Anyway, Senate Budget Committee Chairman Bernie Sanders says Democrats should ignore the recent ruling of the Senate parliamentarian and is vowing to force the Senate to vote this week on an amendment to set the federal minimum wage at $15 an hour. He is rolling full steam ahead. Sanders told reporters on Monday, "My personal view," I'm quoting here, "is that the idea that we have a Senate staffer, a high-ranking staffer, deciding whether 30 million Americans get a pay raise or not is nonsensical. We have got to make that decision, not a staffer who's unelected. So my own view is that we should ignore the rulings, the decision of the parliamentarian," end quote. Senator Elizabeth Warren says she favors a vote to overrule the parliamentarian, but believes that this is the biggest obstacle facing President Biden's agenda. A third woman has now publicly accused New York Governor Andrew Cuomo of unwanted sexual advances. Miss Anna Rush said she'd never met Governor Cuomo before a September 2019 wedding when, shortly after meeting, he moved his hand to her lower back and said she seemed aggressive when she removed it, his hand that is, before asking if he could kiss her. A spokesperson for the governor responded to this new claim by referring reporters to a general statement Cuomo released in which he stated that some of the things he had said previously may have, quote, been misinterpreted as an unwanted flirtation, end quote. Meanwhile, Charlotte Bennett, the second former aide under Cuomo to allege sexual advances from the governor, said that Cuomo's actions are, quote, the actions of an individual who wields his power to avoid justice, end quote, and said to other women that, quote, if you choose to speak your truth, we will be standing with you, end quote. In related news, while they're coming back to the bill here, Senator Elizabeth Warren introduced a bill in the Senate that would impose a new tax on the assets of America's wealthiest individuals. Warren, a new member of the Senate Finance Committee, has long sought a tax increase on millionaires and billionaires in the U.S. The bill would levy a 2% tax for people with a net worth between $50 million and $1 billion. Taxpayers with assets worth over $1 billion would be subject to a 3% tax. Jamarl, what's your take on this?
I think it's a good idea. I think it should have been implemented before. I mean, think about what we're saying for the moment. I mean, because there's a comedic element of this. We were talking about this yesterday. It's like, what, 3 cents over top of like 10 billion? At the very least, that's what the plan used to be that she was talking about. And what are you going to get billionaires saying, I can't, no, I can't be 3 cents per dollar poorer over $10 billion. I just can't take it. I just can't take it. It's too much. It's too much. How am I going to eat? You know, I mean, like, what? Like, how do you say no to that? And maybe that was part of the reason that she made it 3 cents to show how ridiculous it is to have that much money and for us not to even be able to tax that. Honestly, what is the purpose of the state? And what is the power of the state if the state can't use its power to tax? I mean, let's think about what we're saying for the moment and understand why. It's not a situation that the American public doesn't want it. What, 70% of the public is on board for taxing the super wealthy? No, it's not that. It's that the talking heads that are in Washington, the people who are paying the talking heads that are in Washington, the people that are on your media networks that are basically telling you what the talking heads in Washington are saying, all of those people are basically rich. None of those people necessarily want to be taxed, and all of them are paid by people who would be taxed by this. The wealth tax thing is not an issue for us, meaning the majority of the population. 95% of the income gains went to the top 1% under Obama. That number is probably only going to be, dwarfed by Trump. It can only be dwarfed by 5% to make that point. But yeah, the public is on board for this. This is not an issue with the public. This is one of those things where the public needs to figure out why their government is not on board for something that the public would back 1,000,000,000%. That's the question. And so, yeah, Elizabeth Warren, applause for this one. This was something she said earlier. And yeah, I'm glad she's introducing this to put pressure on Biden for it. It's not just her, by the way. It's in the House also.
So then there's this counter argument, which goes something like the people who are say you make, again, this starts at $50 million and goes up to billionaires, and the tax raises, the proposed tax on wealth rises as you go up that ladder. Wouldn't this, if you're say you have $100 million in the bank, that's a crap ton of money. That's a lot of money. Say you have $10 billion in the bank, or across several banks, or $100 billion. Which of those two groups is more likely to be able to take advantage of tax loopholes and shelter their money? I'd argue they're both pretty liable to do that. They're both pretty likely to do that. But if anything, the billionaires probably already taken advantage of that stuff, and they're going to continue to do so. In other words, what this might be in the long run is a squeeze on the people in the middle, creating another sort of inequality where even the ultra wealthy, if you have $50 or $100 million, in my opinion, that's pretty damn wealthy. Even those people, they might lose their money, whereas the billionaires might keep it. Does that make sense? I could see that very easily happening.
I see.
And in general,
I see where you're
people
thinking.
Go with the loopholes anyway.
Yeah, I see how you're thinking. I don't entirely buy that. I mean, it's possible, I suppose. So I'm not going to blow that off. But if you got $50 or $100 million in a bank, you're probably using those loopholes too. Like that level of wealth.
Probably are.
Because it's kind of like if you were dating somebody who's 10 years older. Well, it's pretty, it's big when you're 20 and she's 30. It's another thing when, one is 100 and the other is 90. It doesn't look the same. Like the higher up you go in regards to those numbers, the more agency, the more capability those people have to be able to hide that wealth. Would there be a way for the uber wealthy, like the billionaire class, to hide it more so? Probably, maybe. By the same token, that's no reason to not do it. If anything, that's more of a reason to figure out how you get the billionaire class. Like that's not a push against it. That's more of a, okay, you need to be more diligent in figuring out a way to ensure that the billionaire class can't escape it, that you get the tax loopholes, that you get the offshore accounts that are in trillions of dollars. That would be the alternative. That would be the way to think about it, especially if you had somebody in government that was an avatar for the public's will, who would actually go out and do that, like religiously. That's my thought. That's my thought.
That would certainly be good. I mean, that's what you would have to have, I think. You'd have to have a concerted push on the higher levels to actually close those loopholes and do what you need. People could make the argument, okay, well, people might take their assets overseas. They're worried about a wealth tax in the U.S. and they might take them and spend them overseas. But as far as I can tell, what most of those billionaires or 100 millionaires, whatever, would be spending it on would be like investments. They'd be parking it in the stock market or in the stocks of specific companies, or that would be how they have that net worth anyway. If you look at a lot of the tech billionaires, for instance, they don't have it in cash. They have it in the valuation of their companies. What are they going to do? Pick up their companies and move? I don't know. And even if they weren't spending it in the U.S., what that would probably mean would be they're not spending it in the stock market in the U.S. And frankly, we have too much speculation anyway, in my opinion. But that's another story. We got a couple more headlines to get to here. I want to get to them. Probably only time for one realistically. The Biden administration moved to expand the government's capacity to house migrant children. State-licensed U.S. shelters and foster homes for migrant children were directed to, quote, review their ability to open up additional beds, end quote, by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. According to the Refugee Office's memo, the primary objective is to prevent unaccompanied children from staying for prolonged periods of time in Customs and Border Protection holding facilities. Apprehensions of unaccompanied migrant children along the southern border, which have been rising steadily since last year, spiked this month, straining the U.S. government's limited capacity to house these minors during the coronavirus pandemic. And with that, we've got a lot more to get to, but we'll get to those later in the show. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Those were our headlines, and we'll be back in a minute with our soapbox segment, Jamarl's monologue, and a short conversation thereof. Be right back.
Fault lines.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here.
Real opinions for real people.
Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out,
We actually let them expand on their views.
what's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our stations in Washington, D.C. Excuse me. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. You can also send us, if you want to join in on the conversation, a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Honestly, I am conflicted on where to go today. Cuomo, or Third Woman, has come out to basically accuse Cuomo of sexual harassment. And this woman basically has a picture with Cuomo hands around her face of that particular moment etched in time, in immortality, of Cuomo assaulting that woman, or at the very least making her greatly, greatly uncomfortable with things that he was saying to her being heard in earshot of her friends. But something else is bothering me a little bit more, and we're going to get the opportunity to talk about Cuomo a little bit later. Senior Democrats are abandoning, the Washington Post, are abandoning a backup plan to increase the minimum wage through a corporate tax penalty after encountering numerous practical and political challenges in the drafting of their proposal over the weekend. Basically, the Democrats aren't willing to get rid of the filibuster. And so they are trying to figure out a way to get the $15 an hour minimum wage through. They backed away from budget reconciliation because the parliamentarian basically gave an opinion. The parliamentarian's opinion is not final, can be overruled, and yet here we are. Biden came into this saying he was going to be a type of FDR, even complete with the fireside chats. And what this made me realize, just watching over the course of the last month or so Biden has been in office, is that the difference between Biden and FDR is not that Biden's plans are just smaller and tinier. That's not it. It's not the paucity of the plans that Biden is coming up with. It's the difference, or the difference can be understood in the way that FDR had a very clear understanding of the conceptual terms that underpin America, and more importantly, the social cohesion that gets eroded when we are not in a shared interest. and more importantly, don't see each other in a shared interest. Meaning, it's not just our conception of self in regards to what self does, it's also the conception of government and the conception of government as it relates to self. All of those things are important. And if the individual feels alienated, if the individual feels it is for one but not for all in some kind of way, or for that matter, that the social safety net or the social fabric to which we accrue around is only for a certain particular class, then yes, it undermines the entire level of social cohesion. FDR understood that. The consequences of that erosion can be deep, indelible society instability. And honestly, they're needed to address with all the powers that could be mustered. And this is where FDR exceeded. And that's why he succeeded. He understood that the problems that were associated with government needed to be addressed. And they needed to be addressed in a way that were dramatic, that were pointed, and that got across to the public that you have an avatar. You have somebody who's going to fight for you, that's going to fight for America. And I'm not just going to give you words, I'm going to show it in the things that I am doing and the lengths that I am going to get those things done. He was around during the Russian Revolution. I mean, he saw how a government could fall apart when the public does not believe that the government is working in its behalf. And he, who was being pushed by the socialists, by unions, did what he needed to do to ensure that America was resolved and safe. And what did he say at the end of it? I saved capitalism. How did he save capitalism? By making programs and by making, basically by making programs and giving money back to the bottom of the income spectrum to allow this country to grow. That's what he did. Put it in perspective. Passing Social Security is giving money to the elderly to ensure they're not dying on the streets. The job programs that he passed allowed workers to get back to work. He expanded the number of jobs that were on the federal government because it was necessary. He did his job. He put through unionization efforts. Why? Because FDR understood that there was a need, a great and desperate need, in order to ameliorate the hard edges of this system. He had a sense of urgency. Understand what I'm saying? He had a sense of urgency about what he was doing. We've just had a failed putsch attempt, as far as I can see. A president of the United States decided that he didn't want to leave. He wanted to play the game. He wanted to engage. When he won the game, he would take on the powers of the president. But when he lost, sore loser, kicks over the table and basically tries to get a lot of people to do a lot of illegal things. It screams at the height of his lungs that he himself is being cheated. Nobody was cheating Trump. Trump just lost. And more importantly, and unfortunately, the Republican Party, instead of being horrified by this, they back him. That's the guy that takes the party. None of the people are repentant over what Donald Trump did or even see it as wrong. What does that mean for the next Republican that gets in office? The moderates lost. Trump's people will be taken over. What does it mean for the next person who gets in office when the last guy that did the putsch attempt is not seen with a certain degree of horror, or for that matter, with scandal? They think what he did was fine. I'm making a point that should terrify you to your core, and it should make a sense of urgency in the minds of the Democrats. But it's not there. How do you not pass a $15 an hour minimum wage when you've had the situation of COVID decimating your population, 500,000 dead as a result of government actions, companies utterly destroyed, retail destroyed as a government action? We could have protected those businesses. We could have kept people solvent. We just didn't do it. We didn't care. And now that Joe Biden got in, he's given a Democratic Senate, he's given a Democratic House, and he has the presidency. And he has all powers in the world to do what he needs to do, including destroying the filibuster to enact his agenda. FDR was willing to go to the mat, so much so that he was talking about packing the court. Joe Biden is not even willing to push for a $15 an hour minimum wage. He has the power to do so. He just don't. He has the power to push those Democrats like Manchin or some of these other Democrats that are showing a certain degree of skepticism to plan. Use the bully pulpit. Use the presidency. Use the power of that office. You should have those 2,000 checks by now. That should have already been out the door. You should have the $50,000 of student debt relief. Again, that should have already been out the door. And yes, the $15 an hour minimum wage should be something you're willing to go to the mat for, considering the number of people that were decimated by this. Even before this, 42% of the public made less than or $18,000 an hour. Basically, half of your country is poor, and you're quibbling over whether or not to pass a $15 an hour minimum wage. That's a compromise. It should be higher. It should be higher. FDR didn't get bogged down into the nonsense of bipartisanship, because bipartisanship wasn't the point. The point was to deliver for the American public in a way that the public understood that somebody, at least one individual with powers endowed by the presidency, is working in their interests. And it is in the interest of the Democratic Party to do that. And they don't understand that. They don't have the sense of urgency. And the monster is at the door. Shane, what do you think, man? I think the monster is at the door and these guys are asleep at the wheel. And they're not doing what is necessary in order to basically say, look, we're the party of the working class. We're going to bring this country together. And you do that by having policies that people accrue to, not by partisanship for the sake of it. And you run on this notion that these guys are against me, these guys are against America, these guys are stopping me from enacting this policy. That you beat them over the head with it. You're the president. You got the bully pulpit. Use it. I mean, like, real talk. Use it. Otherwise, you're going to lose it. And like I said, the monster is at the door. The fascists don't believe that what took place. I'm making the point that the Republican Party don't see what took place as wrong. And that should terrify you. That should be terrifying. What are your thoughts?
Well, for a bit there, I couldn't figure out who the monster was. I couldn't tell if you were talking about like a potential insurrection by the wider American public. But if you're talking about a Republican Party push one, I mean, I think they would be more likely to do that if they saw serious movement from the Democrats than if they saw nothing. And right now, they don't see nothing. But yeah.
No, what I mean by that is, if you lose, the people who are going to come in office saw nothing wrong with throwing over the table when they lost. I'm making the point that the Democratic Party right now, there are only two parties. They are basically going to take the presidency back. And that group saw no issue with throwing over the table. That's my point.
I would argue that what the establishment did in response to Trump's victory in 2016 has been dramatically worse than what the establishment has done and what happened in 2021 on January 6th. I would argue that the Russiagate narrative, the shutting down of speech, the shutting down of foreign media, the radical curtailment of people's ability to say what they want to online, the push to prevent the spread of disinformation, all that stuff was way worse following the Russiagate narrative in 2016 than what happened in 2021, which to my mind I wonder who are the monsters. It seems like they're both monsters. It seems like they're both jackals. And frankly, I would rather not have either party pushing for a massive institutional reform, creating new FDR-style, New Deal-style programs, because I don't trust either of them to do so. If I had to trust, a couple of months ago, I probably would have trusted some insurgent candidate on the Republicans to do it more. At this point, after January 6th, I'm really not sure about it. But just to put it simply, I don't trust either of them. I do not trust either of them in the slightest. And I think a lot of people feel the same way. And that could change if you have a quick reformation of one or more of the parties, where you have a populist-style leader coming up and on the left and reforming the Democrats. That could happen, but as things stand, I don't want big action because I don't trust either of them. They're both leviathans. They're both titans with way too much weight and way too little sense. And I'm pretty darn worried that if for one thing, I don't believe that the way that they would implement that program would be good. But even if I doubt that they would implement that kind of program at all, and if they were to start to, I'm worried about what would happen from that. I mean, it's kind of conservative. I'm like, hey, just let's all wait. But I'm pretty open to a reform of one of those parties. I'm just worried about what would happen if the current unreformed parties go and try to launch their big their big crusade. Jamarl, what's your take on that?
The idea that pessimism is not a survival trait. And, it's not that I trust either of the parties from the standpoint of doing things that are entirely and completely in America's interests, wholeheartedly, meaning the best outcome is always out of reach. But that is not a reason not to do the program. I mean, you may be able to wait.
Pessimism and optimism.
Well, you may be able to wait. I mean, but a lot of people can't. I mean, but when Obamacare was passed, you had 26 million people without health care after they said they passed universal health care. And that number is only going up. I mean, you think of the number of people that was out of work for all of this time. You might be able to wait because you may be in a position economically to be able to just kind of chill. I'm telling you, a lot of people are not. You have a lot of people who are eating at food banks right now. You have a lot of people who don't have health care right now. Yeah. Look, I don't trust these guys as far as I can throw them. By the same token, if they are pushing through a program like that, then the people who are in believe in it. Now, what I mean by that is you're not going to get the standard Democrat pushing for a Medicare for all plan. Those people are going to have to be true believers in order to even get that stuff over the finish line. And whatever the leaky bucket is, it's still a large preponderance of the people being benefited by that program. So Social Security, Medicare, those things are run fine. Yes, they're being attacked by Congress and everything else, but the public loves those programs because those things work. I'm not in the camp that believes that it is possible to make a program that benefits the public itself. I'm just not. The evidence is already there that it can be done. I think your issue is you just don't trust the people who are in power now in order to act a plan like that.
But do you?
Yeah.
Do you?
Yeah, it depends on the plan. I mean, honestly, it really does just depend. If it's Medicare for all, it depends on the policy. I need to see the policy right up. If it's a public option, I'm more skeptical of that because to me, that's almost like just giving money to insurance companies. Yeah, we don't want to have Medicare for all. However, we do want to have everybody covered by having the federal government basically give money to insurance companies that is going to cost like 7 times more. So I get what you're saying. It's not this trust of the parties per se. It's the trust of policy. I just need to see the policy. That's all. I'm not. This is not a rah-rah Democrats.
In that sense, we probably don't disagree. But we got to go into our break. But I guess here's what I've got to say in closing on my end. When I said all that stuff, you kind of responded to me as a person, not to the arguments that I was making. You said, well, Shane, you don't need it, and so you don't have this felt sense of urgency. I mean, frankly, you don't know what I need or what my family needs or any of that stuff. I wish you'd responded to the arguments I was making instead of
Shane, that is responding to the arguments.
The position I'm in.
Well, wait, you're a person, and as a person, you have a point of view and a context. You've said before on the show that you don't need the money from the stimulus plan. It's not like we just met today. You've said, I don't need the money on the stimulus plan, which on some level, it gets across that, look, I had my job during this whole event. This is not something that I need. So why can't I pull something that you said prior to talk about that you said now? And by the way, whether it's you, there are a lot of other people. There are a lot of other people who are basically in the same boat that still had their jobs, still was able to work and everything else, that may not need those things. I'm saying that that's one context, but from another context, there are a lot of people that do. That was my point.
You don't. I get you, but you don't know what my family needs, and you don't know the position that I'm in, and I don't know where you are, and it's an uneven argument, and it's also just technically an ad hominem. You're responding to me as a person instead of responding to the claims that I'm making.
I never said anything bad about you to be composed as an ad hominem attack for the first part. And again, the second part, you need to deal with the fact that you have said things over the course of the show that showed you were intact during the time of COVID. I'm not sure why you're freaking out about the fact that I brought up past things that you said to give an indication or context.
I'm not freaking out. I'm just saying.
It sounds like you're freaking out.
To my arguments. Okay. Well,
and I did respond to your arguments. That is a response to your argument, whether you want to accept it or not. And look, whether you want to take it to you or whether you want to take it to the number of people that were perfectly okay and held intact, you can do that. But you weren't attacked by any means.
I didn't say that.
You said I was throwing ad hominems at you. That gives some kind of indication that you were being attacked unfairly, and nobody was attacking you at all in this conversation. But let's do this.
We got to go into a break.
Yeah, let's go to a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment with a fascinating story on 80,000 Mexicans that basically disappeared and ended up in government. Well, you were here. I'll let our guests talk about it. We'll be back in a moment. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to read an amazing story from the LA Times called Where Mexico's Disappeared. Many are in government graves all along. This is a fascinating story that basically 80,000 Mexicans or more have disappeared over the course of the last 15 years. And it's now to believe that these deaths or the people have been passing through either government morgues or ending up in government graves. Effectively, you have a situation where the number of people that have been dying have been outstripping the ability of the government or the country to basically compensate. So they would end up in morgues, and you would have more people than the morgues can process. And this would happen over and over and over again. More than 28,000 of them have been cremated or buried in public cemeteries. Another 2,589 have been donated to medical schools. Most of the rest were still in morgues or cannot be located. And basically, what it's saying is the drug war that had been taking place had been killing so many people that they couldn't keep up with the number of people that were dying. This was a fascinating story right here. In theory, every time a new body arrives to a morgue, it is supposed to be refrigerated. The problem made headlines in 2018 when medical examiners in Jalisco State ran out of space and stuck more than 300 unidentified corpses in 2 tractor trailers that circled the suburbs of Guadalajara, with its residents complained of the smell. The bodies were being put in places because the bodies could not be processed. This story was fascinating. To have a conversation about it, we're joined with Ayerbuch, a journalist who writes for Bloomberg News on the Mexican president and does freelance journalism on Mexican politics for the LA Times, among other outlets. Maya, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. This story was really well written. What made you write this? Like, how did you get wind of this particular case of the number of people that were lost and not necessarily accounted for?
So I think the general issue of disappearances in Mexico is one that is in the news a lot, and often because of these very terrible searches that families are doing kind of on their own, often in pretty remote places or abandoned places, in fields, in garbage dumps, in like the peripheries of cities, to try to find the remains of their loved ones, knowing that they might have been killed, but their body probably hasn't been recovered. And because this is something that they've done really on their own in the last several years, even though groups of family members whose loved ones have disappeared have existed in the country since the 70s, these big searches are front page news. Then the question becomes, once those remains are found, what happens to them? And looking at that issue, I, with colleagues, started to look more into the issue of what was happening with morgues. and there's also been some great work in Mexico on the part of investigative outlets here to try to put a number on how many bodies might be in government custody, which means the other side to this whole search process. Not only talking about people who haven't been found yet, which are the people you hear about most often, but the ones that just can't be identified because we're talking about remains that are in bad condition, and sort of a dearth of forensic services and resources in order to identify them and to find matches.
Well, just to point out 1 second for that, the DNA searches, well, they found problems because some of the bodies were basically sealed together or wedged together in a way where the juices and the fluids combined with one another, making DNA searches difficult. I just thought the story was so fascinating. Please please continue. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There are different forensics issues in every country. You can read about forensics issues in the US and problems with identification here. It's not an issue unique to Mexico. And I think, we've also seen news about public graves in the US. Then the question is, what's the scale relative to the population of the country? And in Mexico, that's the issue we were looking at, is the number of people who are buried all together, so making it very difficult then once an exhumation can happen, which is the current plan for the country, to do these exhumations and to start identifying these bodies. Is it actually going to be possible? And obviously, this is a technical question. Some of it is how good is the DNA you can extract, and then the other is, what are you trying to match that DNA to? So if the records taken in the last 15 years of people who have come forward and said, my kid went missing, if those records aren't very good and if those records aren't centralized, it becomes very hard to try to figure out, in theory, who you could be trying to make that DNA match with. And so they've done sort of state level exhumation projects for individual cemeteries in the last few years, with a lot of care and a lot of oversight of those families. And in some cases, they just don't manage to identify the vast majority of the bodies they remove. And so now they're trying to deal with that problem.
And 80,000 people dying and being displaced over 15 years is a crazy number. That's between 10 and 20 a day.
Right.
Pardon me.
Yeah.
Pardon me. To be clear, yes, not just people dying, but disappearing. Between 10 and 20 a day. And you were describing in your article some cases, for instance, the morgue in Tijuana, where they are equipped to deal with 10 incoming bodies per day, and sometimes they're flooded with two or three dozen. Many more than they're able to handle. I'm curious, a couple of different ways we can come in on this, but I'll start with two of them and I'll let you pick whichever you want. One, how widely known is this as an issue in Mexico? And two, what are the causes? Just very simply trying to set the backdrop up for people. I'm guessing my mind and a lot of people's mind would go to cartel issues. Is that correct? But you could also talk institutionally, just other elements of it, the morgues maybe being underfunded, that kind of thing. What do you see as the causes for this problem? Maya.
I mean, talking about the causes of why people are disappearing and the causes of why they're not identified are somewhat related, but a little different. So just take the first part, why are so many people disappearing? Like, I don't want to put just a few words on it just to simplify it too much. But we talk about the last 15 years, as you both said at the beginning, because it's the period in which Mexico has since Mexico technically started its drug war at the end of 2006. And so there's this huge increase in violence that happens after that. The military is deployed to the streets, and different criminal groups, some of them are dedicated to drug trafficking, some of them are dedicated to many other somewhat illicit activities, respond in kind, and there's a huge amount of violence as a result. And so instead of that just being cataloged as many people dying, it's also cataloged in Mexico as many people disappearing. And that means maybe the fear is maybe they've been recruited, maybe they've been killed, maybe they've been kidnapped. It's sort of hard to say. And obviously, in any individual case, as more time goes by, the presumption is that that person is deceased, but their body hasn't been found or their body hasn't been identified. Then the question of why haven't government services been able to identify them One, it's just hard because of the scale of this violence since 2006, especially. And even though the current government has said, we're not currently waging a war on drugs, that violence hasn't abated. And it's something that is ongoing and that people living here have to deal with in a very visceral way. And then the other part is a question of resources. Like if you talk to people who work in morgues, who are in charge of genetic testing, if you look at previous, as I said, reports by Mexican investigative outlets, you'll hear things like the refrigeration services are not enough, or they don't work since you can lose samples, or there's not enough to test the DNA samples they have adequate testing kits to go through all of them and actually have an adequate genetic profile, or there's not enough medical examiners on hand. And because this ends up being a question that's decided by individual municipalities and the records are not centralized, then the only thing you can do at the moment is do what Quinto Elemento Lab, which is the investigative outlet I mentioned, did, which is do public records request and say, how many bodies do you think you have? Which is where they say we think we have more than 30,000. Though obviously they would have to then do a longer process of exhumations in order to really find out whether that number is the ceiling or the floor.
Maya, we're out of time. I wish we'd had more time. There were other parts of the story we could have gotten into, including visceral stories of like morgues running out of space and running trucks filled with bodies around neighborhoods to the point where they started to smell, and the residents were wondering what was going on. But there's just a deeper tragedy, which is obvious. It's sort of imminent in this, which is a lot of people are dying, and a lot of people can't find their family members. They're getting buried in mass graves. We've got to have you on again sometime soon to talk more about this. For those listening, that was the voice of Maya Ayerbuch. She's a journalist who writes for Bloomberg News on the Mexican president and does freelance journalism on Mexican politics for the LA Times, among other outlets. You can follow her on Twitter at MayaAverbuch. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute with our next guest, Ted Rall, talking about Democrats abandoning the $15 minimum wage and Bernie Sanders potentially fighting for it. We'll be back with Ted on that on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. You know, the conversation we had this morning and the one that I had making this distinction between FDR and Joe Biden, my argument was that it's not entirely just the paucity of Joe Biden's ideas and what he's willing to do. It's the sense of urgency that was in FDR. The world had fallen off of his axis. He saw the Russian Revolution. He was alive during that time. He did not want that for the United States, especially with the number of groups on the left that were at his heels based on the Great Depression and the failure to do anything severe and significant about that Great Depression. He went on a warpath. It was as if aliens had invaded. He used every last power as president and some that he didn't even have in order to mitigate that situation. And like I said, in the end, he said he saved capitalism because he was willing to do it. Joe Biden is missing that sense of urgency. The Democrats are missing that sense of urgency. And like I said, the monster is at the door. You can make a case that the Democrats are horrible. And I would agree 1,000% with that case. By the same token, it was the Republican Party that basically tried to throw over the table and doesn't even see anything wrong with what they did. that is greatly problematic to me, that you can try to topple a government and the other people in the party just basically give it a pass. Democrats are giving these guys a chance by not pushing policy and not pushing for things that will bring this country together in real terms. The $15 an hour minimum wage is just one of those things. It's just so happened to be a big one of those things. And yet, not so much. It seems that Democrats are walking away from it. It seems that Joe Biden has been downing his chances of getting it passed. I don't think I can get it passed. Sanders has come out with a clarion call for this, basically saying he is going to hold Democrats accountable. Right here, this is not being right here. This tweet is this week is part of a reconciliation bill. I will be offering an amendment to raise the minimum to $15 an hour at a time when millions of workers are earning starvation wages. When the minimum wage has not been raised by Congress since 2007, it stands at the pathetic $7.25 an hour. It is time to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. And like I said before, even that number is a compromise. To join us to discuss, we're joined by Ted Rall, political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. Ted, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. I am greatly aggravated by this. Now, it's not so much that I have this belief that Democrats are going to do and fight and go to the mat for the working class. But this was something that just seemed like a good idea all around, that the public basically supports. And that if you as a president wanted to push for something and get a clear win, a completely clear win, something that the other party wouldn't do, something that the other party didn't stand for, and you are saying, I am raising your wages. 42% of the public make, $18,000 an hour. Think of all of those people that are going to have their wages skyrocket as a result of this. That will give you a very strong position going into midterms. As, look, this is what I did for you. My name is Joe Biden. I gave you an increase in your minimum wage. But they're walking away from this. They don't get the urgency of the moment. What do you think, Ted? Am I being too hard on these guys for this?
I think you're being too easy on them. They lied from the very beginning. The minimum wage should, if it had kept up with the official inflation rate since the end of the Vietnam War, should be well over $25 an hour. And so that's what we're really talking about. There is no proposal on the table from the Democratic Party to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. What they're talking about as $15 an hour is really $15 an hour 4 to 5 years from now. It scales up to that. And if the bill would have passed as requested, it would have gone to from $7.25 an hour to $9.50 an hour, still under $10. The Fight for 15 project began with a walkout by fast food workers in New York City 10 years ago, in 2012, 9 years ago. And so this is ridiculous. I mean, basically, they're trying to catch up on something that is, by the time they arrive, the train has already moved past the station with inflation. And inflation is much faster than that. So it should have gone to 50. I think most people have an understanding, based on the way that it's been reported in the media, that the Democrats have been proposing $15 an hour. As soon as Joe Biden's signature hits the paper, it goes to 15. But that's not true. That's not even something they're proposing. And now they're backing away from that. And of course, you could tell, I said that he was going to back away from this because he's expending no political capital whatsoever. This was not important to them. They didn't want to do it. It was always a throwaway thing. Biden and his people knew what the parliamentarian was going to do. Joe Biden's been working on Capitol Hill for 42 years. He doesn't know how parliamentary procedure works. He doesn't know that the minimum wage can't be attached to this kind of legislation. Give me a break. Hey, man, as he would say. So, no, this is, the only argument I think that you could credibly make against doing it at this time is simply the fact that, look, the economy is terrible and employers really are suffering and a lot of businesses have gone under, and, raising payrolls at this particular time is going to be tough for some employers. But the problem is that this society has neglected the minimum wage and working class people for years and years, and it's not just since the last increase. For 40, 50 years, they haven't increased the minimum wage to a substantial amount. So now it's overdue, and it's not the perfect time. But guess what? It's way overdue. It's got to be fixed. It's going to lift a lot of boats. Those people are going to spend that money. It's going to stimulate the economy. And if you can't afford to pay your workers $15 an hour, you can't afford to be in business or to hire workers.
Okay, so I want to treat this politically for a minute. I don't understand the strategy here. The one thing that could make some sense to me is if they were throwing this up for a trial balloon to see how well it performed, and then they saw, they got pushback. But you can expect pushback. You can expect substantial pushback from Republicans and more moderate Democrats. I guess I just literally don't understand what they were going for, because on the flip side of this, by doing this, they've given a sort of tacit promise. They've, aroused people's hopes, and now they're denying.
Alienated their base, by the way. Alienated their base.
Yes. And at a time when Joe Biden hasn't had a press conference yet since moving into the Oval Office, almost a month and a half into it at this point, this could have sent a statement. But between this and the prolonged failure to deliver the $2,000 checks that he promised, it just seems like they're stabbing themselves in the foot. Ted, what's your take?
This is rank speculation, but it's rank speculation I feel pretty good about. I think it went something like this. Last year, when the Biden people were putting together their legislative agenda for following up Trump, they said, okay, well, what are we going to do we're going to promise this minimum wage thing in order to help bring in the Bernie Sanders wing of the party under the fold. Obviously, the $15 minimum wage was very important to Bernie's people. And so this is a way to bring the progressives in. Well, so that's what it was about. And then they said, well, but we don't want to actually pass it, because our corporate contributors wouldn't like it. So we're not going to really do it. We're going to sort of do a half-hearted gesture and then come up with an excuse after January 20th to say why we can't do it. And the progressives will be pissed, as they always are. But by the time the midterms roll around, we'll just use the same old, you have to vote for us, otherwise the even worse Republicans will win thing that always works. And it worked last time in this previous election. And they'll just shut up and vote for us, as they always do, because where else are they going to go? I think it was a con. I think it was a Trump-style con. They told progressives what they wanted to hear, and they never intended to deliver.
And this is why I didn't vote for Joe Biden. Honestly, I did not trust. What I trusted was Joe Biden has been in office for 47 years. He's been in politics, and he has been a fixture, a very specific person for that time. I don't believe for a moment that this leopard was going to change his spots getting into office. And so, I think I voted, I didn't vote for president, either one of these guys, to be honest. Ted Rall, what do you think is going to happen with this? It seems, though, that you do have lefties pressuring Joe Biden. I mean, maybe we have a minute, but Elizabeth Warren is trying to push for this wealth tax, and basically, I think Shane mentioned it was like 3 cents over what, 500 million, Shane?
Over 50 million.
Okay, over 50 million. Okay, that's such a tiny amount of money, and yet, will it go over the finish line? I mean, I haven't heard a huge amount of support from anything out of the Biden administration. What do you think? Is this something that Biden's going to take up? I mean, he seems to have lied about the $15 an hour minimum wage thing. Now they're saying, okay, we're still going to press that. How? You're not going to get rid of the filibuster. So how? So yeah, I think he's lying about that part. What about the wealth tax? He did say that he was going to increase wealth on the rich. Is this going to be the means to which he do it, or are lefties going to get another kick in the teeth?
I think lefties are going to get another kick in the teeth. It's another con job. They're not intending to do this, and they never really pushed for it. And look at his lips, look at his mouth moving. He's not talking about these things. He's not using political capital to talk about it. So that's why I don't think it's going to happen.
The voice that you guys were listening to is Ted Rall, political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. Ted, where can people find your work?
You can go to my website, rall.com, RALL.com.
Very cool. Shane, this is a big deal to me because to me, I have family members that are eating at food banks. I have family members that had members that were ill that didn't have the faculty or the finances to ensure that they were taken care of. And it's aggravating to me to see Biden gets in office. Those people voted for Joe Biden, by the way. And he has the capability of doing those things, but he doesn't. He could get rid of the student debt. He could increase the wage to $15 an hour. If those people had went through their life making a decent wage, they wouldn't be at those food banks, nor would they be in that situation where they are that much more vulnerable at this moment. So, that's the only reason I'm animated about this very specific issue. I don't want them to basically abandon people on this issue. So, you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to be back in a moment with the top of the hour headlines. Back in a moment.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe, welcome to your contact lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am the Batman of news and opinion, your vigilant, indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am somewhere between the Joker and the Penguin in the in that mythos. I don't know where I am. I am your independent political analyst, Jane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Batman is too strong. Batman is too strong. In retrospect, it's like, wow, that's way too strong. That's far too high of an opinion of yourself for doing a YouTube show. So I'm gonna have to tweak that a little bit. But I wanted to change it to something that was more accurate. Like when we first started, we set the intros and everything else up. But I tried to think to ourselves, what am I and what do I do? What is the thing that we are? And at the end of the day, I think we're context. It's like, what is the American perspective and what is context on that perspective? And I think that's what we are. We're basically.
So wait, man, are you? So you're Bruce Wayne? You're the billionaire? Oh,
No. That's what I'm saying. The Batman thing. I was going with this notion of vigilance at going at. I was going with this notion of vigilance, but yeah, Batman thing is too strong, and it's too strange.
You are
yeah.
I know. I hear you. No, it's funny. We're still workshopping this.
Yeah.
There's always. Youth springs eternal. The ability to rethink things and redo things, that is constant. Anyway.
Yeah, well, I was just tinkering with it. And I was like, man, what are we? What are we? And the more I thought about it, I was like, we're context. That's all we are. The show could literally be named Context. That's what we try to get. The mainstream media functions with this 5-minute or 5-year window in regards to everything that has ever happened in the world. We don't. That's our power. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 1,425 new coronavirus deaths and 56,672 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there's been an average of 67,470 cases per day. That is a decrease of 21% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 28,679,600 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, while just over 514,000 have died from it. That number is monstrous. I can't believe we're fighting over $15 an hour minimum wage when 514,000 people that died. That's astonishing. That number is greater than all of our wars, if I'm not mistaken. CDC Director Rochelle Walensky warned states on Monday that, quote, now is not the time, unquote, to lift public health restrictions. This comes as recent statistics show a decline in coronavirus cases and deaths In a press briefing, Walensky said, quote, with the new statistics, I'm really worried about reports that some states are rolling back the exact public health measures we have recommended to protect people from COVID-19. And as Shane and I were talking about earlier, I think the problem is going to become more pressing. The more people, look, everybody is kumbaya right now, but everybody's kumbaya because everybody realizes that everybody can be affected. Everybody is in the same boat. The moment that changes with the number of people who are getting vaccinations that are going to increase, by the end of the year, you may have either half, if not larger than that, of your population vaccinated. That population is not going to want to get vaccinated and stay in the house. And they're going to have great qualms about going out into the public and wanting these restrictions lifted because they are going to feel like they're not vulnerable. The other 50% or the other, whatever that dwindling percentage is, well, they're going to lose more power and agency. And in fact, the scientists that are having this conversation are going to lose more power because this is going to become a political issue the more people that get vaccinated. Mark my words, this is going to become a friction point in regards to people who are going to want to go out the house, who are going to want to go out to dinner, especially with all of the let's say, energy built up from being locked into the house all that time. So the problem they're going to have, believe it or not, is going to be because of the vaccinations, not because they can't get the vaccinations out. Senior Democrats are abandoning a backup plan to increase the minimum wage through a corporate tax penalty. This was ridiculous on its face. Economists and tax experts have said that the tax outlined by Sanders and Wyden could be easily avoided and difficult to implement. Senate Budget Committee Chairman Bernie Sanders says Democrats should ignore the recent ruling of the Senate parliamentarian and has vowed to force the Senate to vote this week on an amendment to set the federal minimum wage at $15 an hour. Sanders told reporters on Monday, quote, my view is that the idea that we have a Senate staffer, a high-ranking staffer, deciding whether 30 million people get a pay raise or not is nonsensical. We have got to make that decision, not a staffer who is unelected. So my own view is that we should ignore the rulings, the decisions of the parliamentarian, unquote. Agreed. Senate Elizabeth Warren says she favors a vote to overrule the parliamentarian, but she believes that this is the biggest obstacle facing Biden's agenda. A parliamentarian and a staffer. Look, that's not the biggest obstacle facing Biden's agenda. The biggest obstacle facing Biden's agenda is Joe Biden. Joe Biden has political capital that he can expend to try to get what he wants across the finish line. He's been expending that political capital on Neera Tanden instead of expending that capital on trying to give people $15 an hour, something that he said he was going to do in a campaign promise. He said nothing about Neera Tanden in a campaign promise. He said everything, wide mouth, about $15 an hour, about the $2,000 that he was going to send people if Ossoff and Warnock got elected, not $1,400 plus $600 from the previous president. I'm making the point that your issues and your problems that are associated with this administration is from this administration. It's not coming from any external source. Joe Biden had all the power in the world. They could have gotten rid of the filibuster. They didn't do it. The parliamentarian could be overruled. They're not going to do it. And the $15 an hour thing could be pushed through if you really wanted to do it. Doesn't have it in them. Doesn't have it in them. And that's unfortunate. In a related news, Senator Elizabeth Warren introduced a bill in the Senate that would impose a tax on assets of America's wealthiest individuals. Warren, a new member of the Senate Finance Committee, has long sought a tax increase on millionaires and billionaires in the United States. That bill will levy a 2% tax for people with a net worth of $50 million and $1 billion. Taxpayers with assets over $1 billion will be subject to a 3% tax. Just to put that in perspective, 2 cents over every dollar over $50 million. You have $50 million in the bank. And every dollar after that, you pay 2 cents on. Think about that. Is that debilitating? And yet you're going to hear people say, yo, man, I can't buy lunch if I have to pay 2 cents on every dollar over $50 million. How am I going to live like that? I can't live like that. I can't buy my other car. I can't pay for my 5th ex-wife. I can't do those things like that. I can't afford this. Watch. Shane, mark my words. You're going to get people out there saying, I can't afford this. You're going to have these billionaires crying on television again, talking about this. Can they afford $50 I mean, 2 cents over $50 million. Is that really burdensome, Shane, as a tax?
No, that's enough for them to continue to grow their money. I'll put it like that. I think real return, this is speculative because nobody knows exactly what inflation is. Estimates are around 2% every year. But like, my point is, it would have to go up to 4 or so percent, 4 5% maybe, before, having it in the stock market, having it in gainful investments or whatever. It'd have to go up to about 5%, I'd say, before they faced a serious risk of losing money. So they're still going to be accruing wealth. That's another way of putting this. Now, I come back to my concern here, which is they're just going to double down on the loopholes. But like you're saying, if you have somebody in the government who is devoted, if you have multiple people, it wouldn't just take one person, but if you have somebody heading an agency, I guess, sure, you got to have people dedicated to closing those loopholes. And then we're going to see there's going to be some serious pushback. Imagine what narratives the media is going to come up with to oppose this, because of course, if you look at who's funding the media, it's predominantly the people who are going to be paying these taxes themselves. If push comes to shove, if it comes to that point, I can't wait to see what BS they spew, but we'll see.
To put this in perspective, if I were to give you $180,000 a day, every day, from the time Jesus was born to now, you still wouldn't have as much money as Jeff Bezos. Like, think about how extreme that is in regards to the amount of wealth. $180,000 a day. And you could still use that for like a billionaire. Where if I gave you like $1 a day, you would still not reach billionaire status. Going all the way back to the time Jesus was born, the numbers are just absurd in regards to the levels of wealth. I feel you on this notion that some people can skirt it. I guess my thing is you just need to have a devoted, specific intent to do it and to go for tax havens and everything else. You just have to, close the loopholes. And Governor Cuomo, come on down. A third woman has publicly accused New York Governor Andrew Cuomo of unwanted sexual advances. Miss Anna Rush said she never met Governor Cuomo before September 2019 wedding when, shortly after the meeting, she moved his hand to her lower back, and she said he seemed aggressive when she moved it before asking if he could kiss her. A spokesperson for the governor responded to this new claim by referring reporters to a general statement Cuomo released in which he stated that some of the things that he had said, quote, may have been misinterpreted as unwanted flirtation. Meanwhile, Charlotte Bennett, the second former aide under Cuomo to allege sexual advances from the governor, said that Cuomo's actions are the actions of an individual who wields his power to avoid justice, and said to other women that, quote, if you choose to speak your truth, we will be standing with you. That is the clarion call for other women to basically come out in this kind of Me Too push. On this, Cuomo is in trouble on this. The new woman that he kissed, Miss Rush, was at a wedding. And this was Cuomo basically hamming it up and everything else. And she said he put his hand on her back. When he moved the hand away, he said that was aggressive and proceeded to get closer. And I forget what he said to her, but whatever he said to her, it was loud enough for his friends to hear. This person wasn't working with Cuomo. She's not a political appointee. She was just at a wedding. And in this context, how he acted here is similar to the way that Charlotte Bennett said he acted towards her and the unsettling advances and conversations that he was making with her in that office.
Cuomo asked if he could kiss her. He asked if he could kiss her.
Is that what he did? Okay.
That's what was overheard.
And her friends were right there and the friends could hear it. That's right. And so this kind of goes back to the first woman, Boylan, who basically said he kissed her unwanted. This goes to Bennett, who basically said when they were alone together in the state capitol office, he was very, he said personal things like, are you monogamous? Do you want to have, do you have sex with older men? I'm open to having sex with a 20-year-old, wink, wink. I mean, it was words slobbered with innuendo. And so Cuomo's sins are basically coming to fruition now with people coming out saying he did it. I don't want this to get away from the fact that Cuomo had been killing and stuffing grandmas under the mattress to avoid attention from Donald Trump, because that has seemed to have been ignored or completely forgotten at this point. Shane.
Well, I just wanted to throw in, we'll be coming back to this at 9:30. We're going to be talking to Michael Goodwin again from the New York Post, which has been doing a consistently good job at covering this stuff for a long time, from what Michael has told us. And yeah, we'll be going into depth on this story, on these new allegations, how they all fit together, Cuomo's political career, all that stuff. 9:30.
Yeah, because this is not good for him. She validates the other two. She validates him. You can't even say, oh, this is a political hatchet job, because the woman wasn't in the political space. Let's keep going. We got one more. The Biden administration moved to expand the government's capacity to house migrant children. State-licensed U.S. shelters and foster homes for migrant children were directed to, quote, review their ability to open up additional beds, unquote, by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. According to the Refugees Office memo, the primary objective is to prevent unaccompanied children from staying for prolonged periods of time in custom and border protection holding facilities. Apprehensions of unaccompanied migrant children along the southern border, which have been rising steadily since last year, spiked this month, straining the U.S. government's limited capacity to house these minors during the coronavirus pandemic. One more. Alexei Navalny was transferred to a penal colony, IK2, in Pokrov, 60 miles east of Moscow. Ruslan Vahakopov of a prisoners' rights group has stated that prisoners are known to cooperate with colony workers to help them control and abuse other inmates for minor violations. Quote, if there is a need to prevent Navalny from communicating with others, nobody would talk to him, unquote. Petor Konorvinov, a lawyer at the Defense of Prisoners' Rights Foundation, NGO, has stated, quote, they will break you. They will break you. Bad things have been going on there for a very long time, unquote. Navalny is serving a 2.5-year prison sentence for parole violations that he claims are politically motivated and falsified. Navalny will be quarantined as a precaution against the spread of coronavirus before joining other prisoners in the colony. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back in a moment with one Mark Frost.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
So Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking about Texas and the aftermath of this winter storm that has left the state's independent power system in straggles, and the company Griddy Energy, which is this variable rate energy plan service provider company that left some customers with bills in the tens of thousands of dollars, struggling. It had been sued in a class action lawsuit to the tune of about over $1 billion. And then now in the last couple of days, Texas's Attorney General has also filed suit against that company. That company itself had previously blamed Texas's Public Utilities Commission for setting the rates that they were following. Now Texas's AG is suing them in return. To talk about this, we are joined by Mark Frost. For those listening, Mark Frost is an economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Schumpeterian, and recovering libertarian. Mark, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Doing pretty good. I fell off a ladder a few days ago and thought I'd hurt myself, but I'm okay. I just had a little sprain. So other than that, I'm fine.
That's no good, man. I'm sorry to hear that. Those things are dangerous. I'm glad to hear you're doing okay, but that's no good. Glad to hear you're recovering.
They are. Ladders kill and injure more people than most people realize. It's a serious danger. As soon as you get on a ladder, you're right in the statistics of death. Check it out.
Yes.
Actually kind of interesting.
No, 100%. That's like a major cause if you're in carpentry or construction, if you're in, building larger structures that require the use of ladders, or heck, just fixing your roof, whatever. No, that's definitely, I know that from personal experience. Know people who've been pretty badly injured by falling off ladders. Anyway, I'm glad to hear you're not doing too poorly after that. Sorry that happened. Let's get into the story here. Like I was talking about, we left off last time we had you on to talk about what was going on in Texas, and we left on an interesting note because we wanted to have this conversation about the free market. I thought we'd get you back on to talk about that. And then more has come up where, again, this company, Gritty, that had a variable rate plan, which basically, I'll let you explain some of the details, but basically, instead of charging people a flat rate for using energy across the board, the rate varies depending on how much energy costs at the time. So most times it's pretty low. Significantly lower, a fraction of the normal cost, like 2-3 cents per kilowatt hour, I think was what Gritty was charging when prices were low. But it can shoot up like crazy when prices get high. And after natural gas extraction and, other sources of energy slowed and in a lot of cases stopped in Texas, it shot up to the cap, which I believe was $9 per kilowatt hour, many, many, many times higher than customers were used to paying. And customers were left on the hook with bills, again, in the tens of thousands of dollars. And these were people who were already without power or low on power, in many cases without water, and in general, struggling with severe and rare weather, a historically harsh winter storm. Now, after you left, I think this is a silly pun, but you are Mark Frost. You are the perfect guest. This is nominative determinism if I ever saw one. To talk about this story, not to pinhole you like that, but I guess we can come back at this from a few angles. Let's talk about the specifics, and then we could get into a conversation about the free market aspects of this as well. In your opinion, again, former Texan resident, lifelong Texan at your heart, as you said, in your opinion, which party is to fault here? Is it Gritty, the company that charged the rates themselves? Is it the Public Utilities Commission that set the price ceiling so high, leaving Gritty to pay these bills? Is it somehow the customer's fault for choosing Gritty, the company, or for not switching to another company when they had a little bit of notice to do so? Mark, what's your take?
If you want me to assign blame, then I'll assign it with one word: consumers. The people that signed up for those variable rate plans, if you read the fine print, they're clearly throwing the dice and saying, I don't want to pay 13 cents per kilowatt hour. I only want to pay 6 cents per kilowatt hour, but that rate's not guaranteed. It can go up. And the economics of what happened in Texas with relating to energy is almost identical to what happened with GameStop. The Wall Street establishment was shorting the stock. The Reddit renegades were going long. They ended up winning. And the Wall Street establishment lost because of supply and demand. And what changed was the Reddit renegades changed expectations. Well, with the uncertainty going on in the economy already anyway, and then, of course, with that massive cold wave, all of a sudden, I think a consistent thing I've always said on this show is you don't have to be well-trained to understand anything about economics, because at the end of the day, economic variables are moved by expectations of the future. So the Reddit renegades changed expectations about the future, and the very cold weather changed expectations about the future. That's why it's called energy futures. All of a sudden, companies that had customers on fixed rate plans had a legal obligation to supply these consumers with electricity, even though they lost money on it marginally for those particular consumers. Now, the greedier consumers, the ones that wanted to save more money, the ones that didn't select the plan or didn't do anything like that, they went in for the cheapest possible kilowatt hour they could get. Well, it's like term life insurance versus whole life insurance. So now what consumers probably never realized, they never looked at the print and they probably said, okay, I can deal with my bill doubling. My guess is that was the psychology of most of the consumers that signed up for it. They're like, okay, so my bill doubles. I can live with that.
I think that's a poor guess.
I'll spin the wheel and say, can that work? Well, what they didn't realize is there's something in finance called gearing. And when you start looking at futures, that's gearing in the sense that the wins and losses are amplified. Whatever the actual experience is, it's amplified. So if you win, your returns are unusually high. If you lose, your losses are unusually low. Now, that's the economics of it. Now, the Texas situation itself, Texas has long prided itself in having its own electrical grid. There's 3 major electrical grids in the United States: Eastern, Western, and Texas. And other than a few border communities, Texas literally has its own grid. That's why if it ever seceded from the United States, Texas would be the one the least hurt because they can just separate from the country. They have their own electrical grid, they have their own natural gas system. So Texas is a little more self-sufficient in that, and it's part of that state's culture. So when this happened, it sort of shook the powers that be in Texas because they're like, okay, we always realized that people that signed up for variable rate plans were spinning the wheel. They were taking a risk, but even we didn't realize it could be geared, that is amplified this strongly. And so what you have in Texas was a perfect storm of Texas going to an unusual model where the electrical grid is highly regulated at the wholesale level, but deregulated at the retail level. So electric companies, which really aren't electric companies, they're really marketing companies. They go off and they pre-buy blocks of electricity from power companies, and then they go sell it. It's kind of like budget phone companies do. They'll make a deal with Verizon and buy X number of hours of data, and then they'll go resell that on their own marketing efforts. They're using Verizon's infrastructure, but they're using their own type of thing. So if you move to Texas today, you'll choose an electric provider, but they're not physically the people that provide your electricity. They don't have electricians per se, even very many on their payroll. They're a marketing company and a billing company and a service company. But the actual electricity creation is done by wholesale companies, and very few Texas consumers even know who actually produces their electricity. Now, you can sign up for, if you want to pay more, you can say, I only want electricity that comes from wind. There's green companies that charge more, but they certify that nothing comes from carbon, that kind of a thing. So that's the Texas market in itself. And it hit the people that bet wrong really, really hard. There's no getting around that. And what hasn't been talked about much in the press at all, a lot has been written about the impact on the individuals that had to suffer through that. Some just turned their electricity off, others throttled it, others had $10,000 bills.
Mark, I got to be honest, I don't agree with you on this. At the very least, who you are putting the blame on. The prosecutor, or the Attorney General's petition filed in Harris Court, basically argues that Giddy, the company that promised Texans cheap wholesale prices that would consistently beat traditional energy costs, blatantly contradicted these promotional representations and auto-debited hundreds of dollars from Texans' checking accounts daily. And like you said, the individual trauma. One Houston resident stated in a complaint that Giddy debited her card $4,677 in 1 week for electricity in an 800-foot square bedroom. Here's the thing. I don't think your economics or your economic calculation takes into account poverty and basically the psychology of somebody who's poor. Now, when an individual is confronted with, if you don't have cash and you're confronted with multiple choices, you're often making bad choices. They often say crime is rational or all crime is rational, because basically the people that are doing it are taking a cost-benefit analysis on what they currently have, what they currently don't have, and what they currently need, or for that matter, what society says they currently need, and make a choice to break the law based on something similar. I'm making the point that something similar is taken here, even though it's not necessarily breaking the law. It's a thought of, what do I have money for, and what don't I have money for, and what are the chances, and they basically made the choice for one over the other because of the prices that they thought they were going to have to pay. But more importantly, like they were, within the context of this, they were being sold this stuff. Like, it wasn't like the companies were just dandelions. They were also being sold these particular products. Like, I guess what I'm getting at is, I don't buy that it's the entire responsibility of the individual, since I don't think the individual understood what they were being sold, for one case. And if people are poor or people are impoverished, or for that matter, even on the edge of that, yeah, they may make a choice in which they think they're going to get the cheaper item. I'm just making the point that it's not a given that they understood that they were what they were getting into. I have family, I have friends that might not have known what they were getting into, and that ended up, honestly, in some of these flexible rate, not with this, but with housing. And they had no idea that it was going to turn out like that. But look, let's do this. I'm going to bring you back because I'm going to let you get your retort. The voice that you guys have been listening to is Mark Frost, economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, marine capitalist, shoot-veterinarian, and recovering libertarian. And honestly, one of my favorite guests. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we continue to be joined by our guest, Mark Frost. He's an economist, professor, consultant, drummer, an Eagle Scout, a Marine, a capitalist, a Schumpeterian, and a recovering libertarian. By the way, throwing this out there real quick, you can and you should follow Mark on Twitter at FrostyCash. Actually, I just need to double check this. Last I checked, yeah, you took a break from Twitter for a little while. Is that right, Mark?
I did. It was making me a bad person. Had to take a break.
Well, it really depends on who you follow, but if you're trying to keep a broad set of tabs on what's going on.
You can follow basket weaving, and it bleeds in. It just does. It doesn't matter. It's a nasty place full of nasty people saying nasty things about topics most of them don't know anything about.
Well, I can definitely sign on to that last one, but no, I know some good people on there. We can agree to disagree on that one. I want to give you time to respond.
On Twitter aren't listened to. It's crazy.
I hear you on that one. No, it is a weirdly harsh environment for certain kinds of open and pleasant discourse, but I think it really does depend on what circles you travel in. But let's get back to it. Jamarl was saying a bunch of stuff there. I wanted to throw it back to you to respond. And then we want to get into this conversation about a Republican civil war, which seems to have very quickly ended with Trump consolidating his power at CPAC. We'll get to that in a couple of minutes. Did you want to respond to what Jamarl was saying as he took us out there?
Yeah, I don't disagree with his sentiments, because one of my big things that I emphasize constantly, anyone certainly that's ever taken my class or knows me well, is the law of diminishing marginal utility. Why is redistributive capitalism better than socialism? Because it lets the entrepreneurial function do what it does well, create money, and then you tax the productive, give it to the less productive, and you have a better society with a higher level of aggregated happiness, so to speak. So yeah, poor people makes a lot of difference. We don't consider the taxes we put on poor people. We don't call them taxes. So for instance, let's say you want a driver's license. If you're a normal middle-class person, you can afford a driver's license. If you're truly poor, $25 to get a driver's license is a serious amount of money for you.
Or a car, or a ticket.
So yeah,
or a ticket, or a ticket. I mean, like a car, like a parking ticket or speeding. Those things are detrimental at that point.
Or insurance. I mean, you're just talking about cars there. It all adds up pretty quickly. Not to mention the price of the vehicle itself.
Or even the quality of car you have to have. In Georgia, if your car is old and maybe a couple things aren't working real well on it, but it still works, they won't let you tag it. And then you'll get a ticket for not having a tag, for not having it registered and all that kind of stuff. And these registration fees that are imposed just for going through daily life are a big burden on the poor. And so it's one of the reasons why I think folks like me, at least, have problems with some of the hardcore libertarian views on roads, for instance. So toll roads, I can afford to go on toll roads all day long. I can do that. Some people have to avoid the toll roads just to make working economically viable. So yes, absolutely, that's always on my mind. What it does to the poor. But your question led with who was at fault, and I argue this is the Dave Chappelle model. I call it that because he's my favorite comedian. I love his work, and then he recently got very upset with Comedy Central because he signed a contract, reneged on it, and then they went and sold his show to HBO and Netflix. Netflix, because they have another engagement with him, just blew it off and said, okay, if you don't like it, we won't show it. But the point is, the man signed a contract. Now, as young as he was at that time, did he understand law? Did he understand everything about contracts? Did he read it thoroughly? Did he understand what? I don't know about any of that. All I know is he did sign a contract, and it did cost the people that he signed the contract with some pain. They suffered some damages. So I disagree with Dave Chappelle that he somehow morally was entitled to a benefit that he walked out on. Now, he became successful with his endeavor because he has market power. He's a big star, and people found it in their rational self-interest not to make him mad. But it's the same model. I suspect most people that buy Google or that use Google products don't read the terms of service that they say, that they accept. But people that chose those really cheap plans, and getting back to the poor people, I've been poor. I've been truly, honestly poor. I know how that looks. It's all today. You're not thinking about your 401k, you don't have one. You're not even thinking about next week. You're thinking about how can I feed myself and my kid today? And so if you have a choice of an electric plan that gives you 12 cents or 6 cents, you're going to take the 6 cents almost regardless of terms. It's what we economists mean when we talk about the concept of time preference. So,
but then you would still blame them. I mean, because that's you were talking earlier about marginal utility and marginal cost and lowering the marginal cost of things. It seems to me like adding, and I get people are litigious and companies are too. They include the fine print for a reason. But as that fine print gets longer and longer, and as its volume hides more and more, that seems like a significant marginal cost that a lot of people can't pay. A lot of people, I mean, I'm guessing if I were to read through the fine print of this energy plan, I am a reasonably educated and intelligent person. I would probably not be able to understand it. I would probably need to resort to hiring a lawyer to help me understand it. And obviously, that's not feasible for the vast majority of people, including myself. So, do you still put the fault on the consumer here? How would you defend that, Mark?
Very easily. I think it's the individual's primary responsibility to understand when they sign something, their signing of it has consequences. And yeah, I mean, I believe now, if there's evidence that they're taking advantage of people, if there's misleading information in the marketing, I don't know about any of that. I've been a Texas customer. I've signed up for Power in Texas several times, and I never felt like I was being misled. In fact, I actually read most of the terms of service, and one of the sections was actually quite good. It actually says right in there, you've selected a variable plan. You're taking the risk of increased energy costs. Now, in my particular one, it was capped. It could only double by 300%. But in Texas, I can't tell you how many choices you have in electricity. You can get only solar. You can get only wind. It's stupid to me because energy is fungible. It all gets transmitted on the same grid. So it doesn't matter whether it came from a windmill or it came from a coal burning plant because it's fungible. It's energy is energy. It isn't like they send the energy actually generated to from the wind plant to your house. They're just saying what they're saying is we're going to have a contract with the wind power producing providers, and we'll only buy we'll buy your proportion of electricity from them. But it's still all put together as electricity and sent on the same lines.
Well, but I'll put it like this: if you're one of the customers who's being advertised this service, whether you read the fine print or not, if they had been marketed, if the marketer who is selling them this service, the salesman had said, at some point, it's very possible, in fact, probable in the long run, that you're going to pay on the order of $10,000 in the course of a couple of days for your service because of precedented but rare weather that, it's likely at some point within the next generation or so we're going to hit, et cetera. I don't know if that's too much detail, but I can't help but feel that a lot of people would have been turned off of this. And so when Texas's AG is alleging deceptive marketing practices, I mean, the marketing isn't in the fine print, practically by definition. Those are the details that you go into, as you're being sold the service. It seems like the marketing should have incorporated the idea very clearly. There could be onerous fees if the weather gets bad, and or if service gets restricted, if energy provision gets restricted in some way. But at the same time, you're gonna save a lot of money in the meanwhile. I don't know how much that was included, and based on the lawsuit and based on the people who clearly were not expecting this, I don't think that was on the label on the product that they were being sold. I don't think that was legible for them. Mark.
Well, that's probably true on every product. I mean, there's something called fat tails in statistical inference, where you have high impact, low probability possible events on those sorts of things. And it isn't that I think the people that did this are bad people. I'm not saying that at all. It sounds like something I might have chosen in my 20s. What my suspicion is neither the customers nor the actual companies that are producing these notepads. I mean, Gritty made their money from a service fee. That's how they made their money. They didn't mark up the electricity. They sold the electricity to the customer at the cheapest possible rate they could get, and they charged whatever it was, $10 a month or something. So their money was from fees, not from reselling electricity. And what they probably didn't do, and even they themselves, obviously, because they've lost a lot of money themselves on their regular plans. Anyone that produced electricity in Texas on a fixed rate plan lost money during that storm. They literally lost. They suffered marginal losses because they had a moral, legal obligation to provide electricity at, say, 10 cents per kilowatt hour, when in fact at the market it was 5,000 cents per kilowatt hour. Those sorts of losses, can hit a company hard, especially those smaller marketing-based, very little padding in their business system to allow for errors like that. And this was
a lot of these companies are going bankrupt right now.
In Texas, very often. What?
A lot of these companies are going bankrupt right now, to be clear. A lot of the companies, a lot of the variable rate plans that suddenly were on the hook for billions of dollars in energy. Well, hundreds of millions when you're talking about individual companies. They're going bankrupt right now because they weren't able to get the money from the customers. They weren't able to pay for it. We've only got a minute left, but I want to turn quickly in our last minute here to the idea of a Republican civil war. Trump gave a speech at CPAC. You were an erstwhile Trump supporter. At one time, you supported Trump, and then I believe around January 6th, I think it was a little bit before that, but it might have been the day itself, you stopped supporting him because you thought that how he had handled it was ridiculous. Now he's rallying support in the Republican Party. It seems like he has consolidated that support with his speech at CPAC, and going into 2022 and 2024, the Republican Party is now characteristically Trumpian. I just want to go to you for your general take briefly. We only have so much time, but Mark, what do you think about these series of events?
I suppose on the good news, on the positive side, I think Trump did transform the Republican Party from primarily a party of snobbish elitists to a party of working class people, all of which are not pretty. On the negative side, I don't see. On the negative side of it, I don't see a Republican civil war per se. I stopped supporting Trump on January 6th. Before the insurrection, it was when he was telling Pence to go against the Constitution and he made up a theory in his head that he could go do. And I spent 3 years criticizing Trump. My main fear was his narcissism. He wouldn't leave. He wouldn't live by the Constitution. People would disappear in the middle of the night. Well, I ended up voting for him because the Democrats lost their mind. But I was always worried about that narcissism part. Will he leave? Well, December came. He has a right to contest elections. But on January 6th, it ends. And he was still stirring it up. Talk about bad advertising, telling his followers just basically wrong, fictitious stuff, and it got them all worked up.
And Mark, just real quick to interrupt you for a moment, because I want you to continue on this for a moment, just for a minute or so. The problem with this, meaning the problem with this notion of who rules, this leadership issue, and how, screaming that the election basically was fraudulent was going to create conflict by definition. I mean, just by destroying the legitimacy of the race itself, you destroyed the legitimacy of the candidate. And legitimacy is the only thing that the candidate has that he's using to assert his right to rule. And that was the thing that was being destroyed in one case with them screaming about Trump and Russia. But in this very specific case where Trump went after the electoral system itself, also the reason that I always make the point that the concession speech is one of the most important aspects of politics. Can you talk about that for a moment? We only have a few minutes, like a minute or so.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with Republicans right now is they don't know who they are. I mean, they really don't. There are Republicans that are really more libertarian than Republican. There's Republicans that are really more Democrat than they are Republican. I know Republicans that are really more progressive than they are Republican. They just don't like the Democrats because they're progressives. And at least, well, that's another story. But so my view of that is that I think the Republican Party has been transformed by Trump for the better. But it's like Syd Barrett of Pink Floyd. They can't be what they could be. Let me say it this way. The future of the Republican Party couldn't have happened without Trump. But it can't happen with him either. The party has
to be clear, who is Syd Barrett here?
I think
is Trump Syd Barrett?
Toxic force. What?
I'm sorry for interrupting. There was a lull there. Who is Syd Barrett here?
Oh, I'm sorry. Pink Floyd.
No, I know, but which person in this political equation is playing the part of former Pink Floyd, now deceased Syd Barrett?
Oh, Trump himself. Because I don't believe that the Republican Party would have transformed itself without Trump.
I see.
So whether you love it or whether you hate it, Trump gets credit for transforming the Republican Party. That being said, what do we want it to transform into? I don't know what Trump thinks politically, ideologically enough to even know. I think Trump is such a narcissist that what Trump likes is whatever makes Trump feel good about himself. That's my psychological.
It seems to be. It does seem to continue to appeal to people, though. Like we were talking, we got to close this out. But during CPAC, they had a straw poll on who people would elect if given the opportunity. When they were given the choice of Trump, he won overwhelmingly. When they weren't, Ron DeSantis was at the head, but he was distant second place behind Trump. So he still has the hearts and minds. He still has the votes. Whether that'll be enough in 2024 or for that matter in 2022 is another matter. But he seems to be steering it, with Trumpism, which he himself was sort of struggling to define during his speech at CPAC. But anyway, larger conversation. We need to close it here. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Always enjoy it.
Same here. Same on our end. For those listening, that was the voice of Mark Frost. He's an economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Schimpetarian, and recovering libertarian. And you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we'll be back in a minute introducing our new producer to you. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and myself, Shane Stranahan. And we are joined now by our new producer, MariTi. MariTi, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing all right. How y'all feeling?
Good. Thank you for being with us. So introducing you to the world and the world to you, MariTi, our new producer on staff here, doing a great job so far. You just started your first full-time part this week, and you got experience working in the press, covering UN briefings. Interesting background. Can you tell our audience a little bit more about yourself, please?
Yeah, no problem. My name is MariTi. I'm originally from Harlem, New York, and I did a lot of work. I graduated from undergrad with my psych degree and then graduate school with my psych degree, but I ended up falling into journalism, especially after I spent 3 years living in Japan. I came back and I started working for a Japanese news company, which covered the UN. And so that's where I kind of got my kick into journalism and started doing that.
That is so wild.
When it ended up happening, I got a little bit more independent. And now here I am.
That is so wild. And what seems to be a norm for Radio Sputnik is that people tend to be internationalists. Like they tend to have these things where they've experienced being abroad. They've looked at the world kind of like if they were sitting on the moon looking at the world, where it's not just this kind of one nationalistic perspective, this kind of humanist whole world point of view. And so that I'm sitting here like, wow, she was in Japan. She was working for a Japan news agency. That is pretty wild. What did you think of that experience? What was that experience like, being at a Japanese news agency covering the United Nations? That's so wild.
Well, it was I spent 3 years living in Japan before I had gotten into the Japanese news industry. So I kind of knew the bureaucracy behind it. And so once you get into Japanese bureaucracy, then you kind of know that things are just they're very, it gets deep into that. So I already had my background in that. So when I started working at the UN, I'm a very headstrong woman. So it's I was tossed in fairly new, and I was just I'm going to go in this, trying to figure out everything, trying to talk to everybody. And so it was really interesting because it was once you see, in the UN, the Japanese news companies actually cover the majority of the news companies in the UN. They make up for the majority of them. And it's just seeing how they work versus how I work. It was kind of a bit of a weird combat there, but it was definitely an interesting experience, and I got to learn a lot about the UN.
Wait, what do you mean? Seeing how they work versus seeing how you work? And also, what did you get to learn about the UN? Both of these things are fascinating questions.
So it's when the Japanese news companies, I don't want to speak too much on how they work, but they're kind of a bit more reserved in their approach Like they're a bit more like wait for the person to come up to you and start speaking, and I'm just like, hey, who are you and what's your name and what's going on in Myanmar?
Yeah,
and
there's a
stuff
cultural
like that.
difference.
So,
Yeah, the cultural difference.
Definitely that cultural difference. Like a lot of people from Japan call it the Gaijin smash. It's just like we just bust in there and then we're there. And so like I learned a lot about the UN was that, you know, there's a lot of bureaucracy going on in there too. Like everybody sees it as this place where people are supposed to come together and like find the answers and make things work. But then when you see the like behind the scenes, that's not actually what's going on and stuff like that. I can go on about the UN for days, but it's just like everything on that you see for like you always got to peek behind the veil. And that's the same when it comes to news. It's like you can't just take everything like face front. You got to like go and see what's really going on behind the scenes. And once you see what's going on behind the scenes, you start to see that, you know, not everything is what they make it out to be. So that's what the United Nations
Stuff gets
ended up being.
filtered. There's a bias on how it's get covered, on how what they're doing gets covered, and of course there's a bias on what they choose to focus on. I want to go into this in a little bit more depth because I'm sure for a lot of the audience this is just fascinating. It's for me for sure. You said you got a chance to peek behind the veil. What else did you see? Please go into it, MariTi.
Yeah, it's like how can I say? Like mainly what I saw is that, you know, there is a lot of that hierarchy that goes on at the United Nations, and it sometimes isn't always for the benefit of the people, if you know what I mean. So it's like, let's take, for example, the situation that's going on in Myanmar now. The United States just got a new ambassador to the United Nations. And one of the first things she's like is, oh, we got to put pressure on Myanmar because of this big coup. And I've been covering like the coup in Myanmar, and like when it first happened, like I also covered what happened on January 6th at the Capitol. And that's when I saw a lot of people on the internet tried to call that a coup. I was like, that is not a coup. So when I saw what happened in Myanmar, I was like, see, that's how you stage a coup. But even then, like I said, you got to peek behind the veil because everything isn't like everybody wants to say, look at the military, look at what they're doing. Like they arrested Aung San Suu Kyi. And it's like, even when you look back on her history, it's like you've had someone on the show who mentioned this before, but she's grown up like sitting on the laps of military. Like she's grew up with the military. She never if you look at prior interviews, she's never really condemned the military or like has gone out of her way to like say that there's a genocide going on in Myanmar the way that a lot of people say. Like she won't call it a genocide.
Well, not just not calling it a genocide. Just to interrupt real quick, there was concerns that she was more on top of it than the military. Like when you read into it, there were concerns that she was going to try to become a dictator of the country. Like that was a concern in the way that she was trying to minimize power in this way. She was trying to take power. And even in regards to the Rohingya genocide, that she was one of the main participants in pushing for that genocide. So, yeah, I mean, it's a thicket, you know, a political thicket. Please continue though.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying, because you have this same conversation going on in the UN where everybody's like saying, oh, we got to look at what's going on. We got to help them. We got to help people in Myanmar. But it's a lot of hypocrisy going on because, like I said, whatever Suu Kyi was planning on doing, that's on her. But once you look at her, like she never denied who she was. Like everybody, like it seems like a lot of people want to martyr. But once you see previous interviews with her, she's always said, you know, everybody tried to compare her to the likes of Gandhi and Mother Teresa. And they're like, are you willing to put your life on the line for your country? And she was like, nah, I was never like planning on doing that. I never said that I was that type of person. So she never tried to hide behind that veil. And that's the whole thing. The UN tries to hide behind that veil. So now you have the United States trying to step in saying, oh, we need to put pressure on Myanmar. And it's like, United States, like, I'm patriotic all day, but you got to look back and see United States. Look at how many coups you've been involved in.
Yeah.
And now you got the nerve to talk about what's going on on somebody else's territory.
Yeah.
So it's like, whatever's going on in the military, they're taking it.
I just imagine, Marie, pardon me for interrupting. I imagine you trying to get into conversations with people either at the UN or in the press while you were working in these jobs. As you know, I don't know what your political convictions were before that, but it sounds like they were definitely added to by having those experiences. That was probably a weird set of conversations if you chose to get into that. How did you deal with that, MariTi?
A lot of it didn't actually happen, like, you know, in front of a camera is the thing. And that's the big part of the United Nations, is like everything you see, like, that's actually put on camera, like the biggest conversation happens behind closed doors. And sometimes it's not even with the diplomats, it's with like just the regular workers at the UN or the security at the UN. So it's like you get a lot of different perspectives of what's going on. And there's a lot that's actually going on, is the point that I was trying to make. So it's like everybody just thinks that they can see one perspective or one point of view and run with that. And it's like, no, there's like a million things going on behind the scenes.
MariTi, we only have about 2 minutes before we have, 1 minute. Okay, I just heard Andre. But if the UN doesn't necessarily have power in the strict sense, in the way of nation states. So influence, how do they peddle influence? I mean, we have about a minute. That's just if you can explain it in that short period of time.
The UN makes it look like they don't have power, but they actually do. Like, they have power in the sense of they can push a certain narrative and they can push an idea, but it also has to do with how they're approached by certain countries. And certain countries approach it in a sense of trying to do what's right. Like, not everybody and like everything going on in the UN is corrupt, but there are a lot of people who are corrupt who do get more attention. I mean, just look at the Security Council, and then you can see the type of power that the UN actually does have.
So, okay, so the voice that you guys have been listening to for this hour, honestly, a fascinating conversation. You've had an interesting life, to put it mildly. MariTi Lovell, she is the new producer at Fault Lines. She will be helping us out, and you will probably be hearing her on the show. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, events, and more across our divided country as well as our divided globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, hope everybody's morning continues to go well. Great show so far. Let's get back into the headlines. First up, in COVID news, at least 1,425 new coronavirus deaths and 56,672 new cases of COVID were reported in the U.S. yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 67,470 cases per day. That's a decrease of 21% from the average 2 weeks earlier. And as of this morning, more than 28,679,000 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, while over 514,000 people have died from it. CDC Director Rochelle Walensky warned states on Monday that now is not the time to lift public health restrictions. This comes as recent statistics show decline in coronavirus cases and deaths. In a press briefing, Walensky said, quote, "With these new statistics, I'm really worried about reports that more states are rolling back the exact public health measures we have recommended to protect people from COVID-19, end quote. In national news, senior Democrats are abandoning a backup plan to increase the minimum wage through a corporate tax penalty. Economists and tax experts have said that the tax outlined by Sanders and Wyden could be easily avoided and difficult to implement. Senate Budget Committee Chairman Bernie Sanders said Democrats should ignore the recent ruling of the Senate parliamentarian, and he is vowing to force the Senate to vote this week on an amendment to set the federal minimum wage at $15 an hour. Sanders told reporters on Monday that, quote, "My personal view is that the idea that we have a Senate staffer, a high-ranking staffer, deciding whether 30 million Americans get a pay raise or not is nonsensical. We have got to make that decision, not a staffer who's unelected. So my own view is that we should ignore the rulings, the decision of the parliamentarian," end quote. Senator Elizabeth Warren says she favors a vote to overrule the parliamentarian, but believes that this is the biggest obstacle facing President Biden's agenda. In related news, on Senator Elizabeth Warren, she has introduced a bill in the Senate that would impose a new tax on the assets of America's wealthiest individuals. Warren, a new member of the Senate Finance Committee, has long sought a tax increase on millionaires and billionaires in the U.S. The bill would levy a 2% tax for people with a net worth between $50 million and $1 billion in assets. Taxpayers with assets worth over $1 billion would be subject to a 3% tax. A third woman has now publicly accused New York Governor Andrew Cuomo of unwanted sexual advances. Miss Anna Rush said she'd never met Governor Cuomo before a September 2019 wedding when, shortly after meeting, he moved his hand to her lower back and said she seemed aggressive when she removed it before asking if he could kiss her. That was overheard by friends of hers standing nearby. A spokesperson for the governor responded to this new claim by referring reporters to a general statement Cuomo released in which he stated that some of the things he had said may, quote, have been misinterpreted as an unwanted flirtation, end quote. Meanwhile, Charlotte Bennett, the second former aide under Cuomo to alleged sexual advances from the governor, said that Cuomo's actions are the actions of an individual who wields his power to avoid justice, and said to other women that, quote, if you choose to speak your truth, we will be standing with you, end quote. The Biden administration moved to expand the government's capacity to house migrant children. State-licensed U.S. shelters and foster homes for migrant children were directed to, quote, review their ability to open up additional beds, end quote, by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. According to the Refugee Office's memo, the primary objective is to prevent unaccompanied children from staying for prolonged periods of time in customs and border protection holding facilities. Apprehensions of unaccompanied migrant children along the southern border, which have been rising steadily since last year, spiked this month, straining the U.S. government's limited capacity to house these minors during the coronavirus pandemic. In international news, Alexei Navalny was transferred to penal colony IK-2 in Pokrov, 60 miles east of Moscow. Ruslan Vakapov of a prisoners' rights group has stated the prisoners are known to cooperate with colony workers to help them control and abuse other inmates for minor violations. Quote, he said, quote, if there is a need to prevent Navalny from communicating with others, nobody would talk to him, end quote. Meanwhile, Peter Kuryanov, lawyer at the Defense of Prisoners' Rights Foundation, NGO, has stated, quote, they will break you. Bad things have been going on there for a long time, end quote. Navalny is serving a 2.5-year prison sentence for parole violations that he claims are politically motivated and falsified, pardon me, end quote. Navalny will be quarantined as a precaution against the spread of coronavirus before joining other prisoners in the colony. And I don't want to engage in whataboutism, quote unquote, but it also, I just can't help but think of the United States prisons, where our main problem seems to be overpopulation and the fact that we have the largest incarcerated percentage of our population in the world. Whereas between Sergei Magnitsky and the allegations, about him, what was going on with him, Navalny, et cetera, Russia's problem seems to be that its prisons have relatively crappy conditions. But, ours do too in their own way. Just doing the sort of relevant key comparison there between our countries. Linda Thomas Greenfield, the new U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, urged the international community on Monday to, quote, ramp up pressure, end quote, on Myanmar's military to restore democracy. Speaking on the first day of the U.S. presidency of the Security Council in March, she touched on a number of other global hotspots. On the February 1st coup in Myanmar and the current military crackdown on protesters, Thomas Greenfield reiterated U.S. support to the people of Myanmar, saying, quote, we stand strongly with them, end quote. Thomas Greenfield said the council plans to hold discussions on Myanmar this month, sooner rather than later, and she hopes to push for more intense discussions. She also said she hopes to work with Russia and China on some key issues. That's heartening. By the way, we just had a good conversation with our new producer, MariTi Lovell. You can go check that out. That was in the last 15-minute segments, and she has worked in the UN as a reporter before and was talking about some of the hypocrisy she had seen and experienced there, specifically on the issue of Myanmar. It was just an interesting back and forth and illuminating. Go back and check that out. It's about 10 minutes ago at this point. Back to the headlines. A U.S. State Department spokesperson said Monday that Washington would not issue a blanket ban on selling weapons to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The announcement comes after Biden said he was ending U.S. support for Riyadh's offensive operations in Yemen, but not military support for Saudi Arabia overall. State Department spokesperson Edward Price said at a press briefing that, quote, that's the way it should be. They will be evaluated on a case-by-case basis going forward, end quote. In 2020, the Saudi military budget was the world's 9th largest, spending $48.5 billion that year, according to the International Institute for Strategic Studies think tank. That total is larger than the defense budgets of South Korea, Italy, Canada, Australia, and Brazil, among many other countries. One of the Iraqi militant groups, Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba, has said it reserves the right to attack the U.S. installations in the country as a response to Washington's bombing of the group's positions in Syria. Al-Nujaba originally had an agreement with the Iraqi government not to target American facilities, but stressed it was no longer the case. The U.S. attack on the Iraqi militia's positions in Syria near the border with Iraq took place on the night between the 25th and 26th of February and came in retaliation for a series of rocket attacks on American positions in Baghdad. Although Jamarl, like you rightfully pointed out, I believe it was the New York Times that was reporting on this, although it could have been the Washington Post, they weren't certain that either that this militia was based at that location, which it seems that they were, or more importantly, in my opinion, that this militia was responsible for the rocket attacks that America was allegedly, retaliating.
Entirely right. Entirely right.
Kind on.
So supposedly we retaliated for the February 15th killing of the contractor. I think it was a Filipino gentleman, in addition to, like you said, missile strikes on American installations. The New York Times and many of the other publications breathlessly went out and screamed that this was Iran, these guys were backed by Iran. And New York Times even prints the headline, very strong, Iranian backed. They said it very clear, right here. Well, basically, the Iranian backed groups did XYZ. When you get 8 paragraphs into the New York Times article that basically proclaim that Iran-backed groups were responsible, quote, little is known about the group, including whether or not it's backed by Iran or related to organizations that use the facilities American airstrikes targeted on Thursday. Little is known about the group, including whether or not they're backed by Iran. That's the point. They don't know. They don't know. Right, and some American officials contend that the group is merely a front for one of the better-known Shia militias. Look, I just contend to you that a lot of stuff happens on the ground, and we like to make it as if these guys are in the know. Like in movies, it's like all of this stuff is mechanical, all of this stuff is well known, the information is always well presented, and it's not that way. It's not that way. You can look at the number of civilian deaths through Obama's administration. It's not that way. And we should be greatly bothered that Joe Biden would do this. And nowhere in this article brings up the point of whether or not this was legal. Because God knows
it
wasn't.
Constitutional. Yeah.
Right, or if it was constitutional.
If this is an impeachable move, which it would be insane for us to assume that anybody's going to impeach Joe Biden on yet another war crime in a long line of war crimes committed by American presidents, but still, that should be, as John Kiriakou said, that should be a question that comes to our mind. It should be, whether this was legal or not, should be something we're thinking about. Anyway, thanks for that summary, Jamarl. Back to the headlines. In France, Nicolas Sarkozy, who served as the president of France from 2007 to 2012, has been sentenced to prison for corruption and influence peddling. Sarkozy, 66 years old, was found guilty of trying to illegally obtain information. According to the prosecution, Sarkozy and his attorney, Jerry Herzog, tried to bribe a federal magistrate, Gilbert Azabert, by offering him a high-profile position in return for information about an ongoing investigation into Sarkozy's campaign funds. While Sarkozy was ultimately cleared of the campaign finance charges, he was indicted for bribery. He was given a 3-year sentence by a French court, but 2 of those years have been suspended. The judge said that Sarkozy could serve his sentence under house confinement. He could, and he probably will, but we'll see. In Nigeria, hundreds of Nigerian schoolgirls abducted last week from a boarding school in the northwestern Zamfara state have been released. The government last week said 317 had been kidnapped. Gunmen abducted the girls from the Government Girls Junior Secondary School in Jangebe town on Friday. Zamfara State Governor Bello Matawale said they would be taken for medical examinations before being reunited with their families. And in Ethiopia, Yerme Gebru, who works for BBC Tigrinya, was detained by the military along with 4 other people in the regional capital, Mekelle. They are reported to have been taken to a military camp. Ethiopia's government has been fighting rebel forces in Tigray since November. After months of an effective media blackout since the start of the conflict in Tigray, a northern province in Ethiopia, the government granted access to some international media organizations last week. The BBC is yet to establish the reason for his detention. A spokesperson for the BBC said that, quote, "We have expressed our concern to the Ethiopian authorities and are awaiting their response," end quote. In Belarus, according to former presidential candidate Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko will leave his post this year. Belarus's presidential election took place on August 9th, with the official results naming Lukashenko as the victor. Tikhanovskaya was his closest rival, although her supporters believe the vote was rigged and she is the true victor. Following the election, street protests erupted throughout the country, and the EU has imposed 3 sets of sanctions on the country, banning some influential individuals from entering the EU. In tech news, Swedish car maker Volvo has said it will make only electric cars by 2030. The Swedish brand said that as part of that transition, it wants half of its sales in 2025 to be electric cars and the other half hybrids. That means it will stop selling vehicles powered solely by gasoline or diesel just 4 years from now. In Earth and Science news, Russia launched its space satellite Arctica M on Sunday on a mission to monitor the climate and environment in the Arctic. The Arctica M will have a highly elliptical orbit that passes high over northern latitudes, allowing it to monitor northern regions for lengthy periods before it loops back down under Earth. The satellite will also be able to retransmit distress signals from ships, aircraft, or people in remote areas. Russia plans to send up a second satellite in 2023, and combined, the two will offer round-the-clock, all-weather monitoring of the Arctic Ocean and the surface of the Earth. Crew members of Expedition 64 at the ISS, that's the International Space Station, have performed their 71st spacewalk, which lasted about 6.5 hours. NASA astronauts Kate Rubins and Victor Glover exited the space station in order to assemble and install modification kits required for upcoming solar array upgrades. The next spacewalk will be performed on March 5th by Kate Rubins and Soichi Noguchi. And last, in business news, Robert Unanue, the chief executive officer at Goya Foods, Inc., aligned himself with former President Trump's election fraud allegations during a speech at the Conservative Political Action Conference on Sunday, that's CPAC. Unanue referred to Trump as the real, the legitimate, and the still actual, quote-unquote, chief of the executive branch. The Goya Foods CEO has faced ongoing backlash for comments endorsing Trump over the past year. And with that, those are our headlines. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, but we'll be back in a minute with our next guest, Scott Ritter. Be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys are in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Joe Biden ordered his first mass killing last week with a revenge attack on facilities located on the border of Syria and Iraq, resulting in the deaths of 22 Iraqis in Syria in a bid to send some sort of message to Iran. It should be noted, the attacks are in Syria to avoid political problems with the Iraqi government that already wants our troops to leave. It also should be noted again that the people that were killed in the attack were Iraqis, not Iranians, despite the fact that the message is supposed to be sent to Iran. The Pentagon Press Secretary John F. Kirby spoke to reporters saying, "We have acted in a deliberate manner that aims to de-escalate the overall situation in both Syria and Iraq." And again, this was based on missile attacks that had taken place and a killing of a contractor on February the 15th. Here's the reality of it. Joe Biden has basically did a missile attack. This is his first missile attack. And the outcome of this, look, could be more perilous than I think people are giving it credit for. A, is it illegal? B, should he be impeached for, again, attacking other countries, sovereign nations, without going through Congress, and not just not going through Congress, is breaking our law and breaking international law. But no one at this point cares. And the media, again, doesn't even bring it up. To discuss this with us, we are joined by former UN weapons inspector and WMD whistleblower, Scott Ritter. Scott, thank you for joining us, man. I appreciate you joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. First, is there anything that I got wrong in the explanation of what is taking place? I know I injected my opinion into it, but everybody puts their stake in the ground somewhere. And on top of that, the issue of legality is something that is very interesting to me. What fig leaf, what legal structure is Joe Biden using to affect this and to basically make the legal argument that this is a just and legal act, either by our law or by international laws?
Well, let's start with that. First of all, under international law, it's an illegal attack. I mean, Syria is a sovereign state. The United States struck Syria without provocation. The causal analysis that's being proffered by Kirby and others is nonsensical. You have a Iraqi militia, the Blood of the Dawn or something of that nature. It's a rogue militia that broke away from the Popular Forces. The Popular Forces is an umbrella organization of militias created in 2014 when the Iraqi army collapsed and ISIS expanded out of Syria into western Iraq, captured the city of Mosul, and was driving toward the Iraqi capital of Baghdad. Iraqi Shia leaders mobilized the Shia population. They formed these militias. The Iranian government sent Qasem Soleimani and Iranian advisors to assist in the arming, training, and direction of these militias to stop ISIS and then ultimately drive them back and defeat them.
That's right. This group was fighting ISIS. That's the other part that they leave out. Yeah.
Sometime last year, the Iraqi government, responding to criticism that you had these independent militias pretty much doing what they want, absorbed them into the official Iraqi security services infrastructure. So these militias aren't militias. These are organizations that operate as an extension, as a part of the Iraqi government, as a formal security service. And part of that, by bringing them into this formality, they have to obey the orders of the Iraqi government. The Iraqi government gave the order, and it was backed by the Iranian government, that these militias will not attack American installations, American service members. They will stand down to create an opportunity for the Iraqi government and the United States to negotiate a settlement on, what to do with American troops the Iraqi parliament voted should leave the country. People who were part of these militias, more fanatical people, said, heck no. And they broke away and they formed these rogue elements. And it's one of these rogue elements that carried out the attack. We bombed the wrong guys. We bombed guys who were operating inside Syria at the invitation of the Syrian government, people who were working for the Iraqi government for the sole purpose of preventing a resurgence of ISIS in the region. We were ISIS's air force, in effect. We attacked the forces on the ground in Syria that were helping prevent an ISIS resurgence. That's the kind of lunacy. We didn't bomb the militia that launched the attack. We know where they are, by the way. We know where these guys are. We have effective intelligence services who could pinpoint the location of at least some of these members inside Iraq, but we cannot attack inside Iraq because the Iraqi government would not permit it. That's what got us in trouble last time with the Iraqi government. When we launched a series of attacks, including the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and al-Muhandis, the Iraqi head of this popular militia force, we assassinated them in Baghdad without notifying the Iraqi government, without getting their permission. And that's what led Parliament to say the Americans must leave. And this is what Kirby speaks about when he says we've acted in a manner to de-escalate. I guess by bombing Iraqis in Syria, we avoid the ire of the Iraqi government because we didn't bomb Iraqis inside Iraq. Either way, this was a boneheaded, stupid move. It will backfire. There will be repercussions. It did not send a signal to Iran, except that the United States simply doesn't care about international law. Now, you asked a tougher question, which is about domestic law. You know, the United States Congress has abrogated its constitutionally mandated authorities when it comes to declaring war. You know, passing a series of War Powers Acts and use of military force authorizations that have diluted congressional involvement to such an extent that the only authority necessary to carry out a limited strike of this nature is Article 2 authorities by the president, you know, that the president of the United States can invoke at will. So what I'm trying to say is Biden did not violate U.S. law. U.S. law, as currently executed based upon established precedent, gives him the full authority to do what he did. No one in Congress with any power. I mean, the Congress is a big institution. You'll have the odd voice speaking out with moral outrage, and I support them. But no one in Congress is going to seriously pursue this as the president violating international or violating national law, because Congress has allowed the precedent to be established for a president to use Article 2 authorities to carry out limited strikes of this nature.
I know that, but
I think Tulsi Gabbard. I'll hand it right back to you, Jamarl. I just think Tulsi Gabbard was the only person I saw even talking about this in those terms. And she alone does not have the power to do anything. Jamarl, what were you saying?
No, she doesn't have the power to do anything. I guess I'm making a distinction between what Congress will say, what the president will say, versus what is breaking our laws. And if these guys are using the authorization of military force, basically using the thought process of Iraq and stretching it to encompass Syria, which is basically what Obama was doing. I mean, when Tulsi Gabbard was questioning the military leaders, Mathis, and made the point that says, look, what legal right do we have to be there? And Mathis said, it's complicated. It was complicated with Bush. It's complicated now. Meaning, it's not complicated. It's just illegal. Like, I guess the point I'm getting at is whether or not anybody in Congress will say something about it or not is different than whether or not it's illegal. And I'm saying it is.
Yeah, the interesting thing about this strike is that the Biden administration purposefully did not cite existing authorization use of military force, meaning they understand the legal complexities, to paraphrase Mattis, that comes with trying to expand authorizations, for military force related to terrorism to attack this facility. They realized there could be no sound linkage, so they simply acted based upon Article 2 powers invested in the president by the Constitution of the United States. So that's one thing that separates what Biden did differently from what Obama and even Trump did. They all went back to an expansive view of the existing authorization of use of military force. And Tulsi Gabbard and several other members of Congress rightly pointed out that the authorization use of military force does not give the president carte blanche to bomb anywhere he wants. That it has to be within the framework established by Congress. So Biden sidestepped this by simply saying, no, this is Article 2 powers. And frankly speaking, again, I hate to concede this to Biden, but the way that Congress has abrogated its authorities on here and watered it down, and based upon existing precedent where presidents have acted and Congress has failed to respond, you would have a hard time getting any court in America. First of all, no court would ever touch this, but you'd have a hard time making an argument that Biden actually violated U.S. law. You can say, and I do believe that what he did was wrong, stupid, etc. But unfortunately, given the fact that Congress has punted on this so much, when the president says Article 2 gives me the power, he's right, because Congress
by the precedent, set against the backdrop of that precedent, like you're saying, and that's domestically, the story is a bit different internationally. I want to get back to the topic of the airstrike itself. The only reason I can see here is he's trying to appeal to hardliners by striking, like you're saying, not the militia, not the group that was responsible for the attack on American troops, but by attacking an unrelated, allegedly Iranian affiliate, or a group funded by, related to Iran. The only reason I can see for him to do that, to strike against another foe, is he wants to appeal to hardliners in his Congress and in the American intelligence community, in the DOD, et cetera. Is there something I'm missing here? Like, I could also see him trying to set Iran or this group up for a proxy, a sort of retributive conflict, an ongoing, escalating proxy conflict that might be in the interests of the American state. What am I missing here, Scott? Why do you do this?
I think, first of all, your analysis is sound because you're trying to apply logic, and you're, even though you may disagree with, the direction the president's taken, you're imparting a professionalism to the Biden administration and those who make that decision that I will tell you doesn't exist. And this is why. This target was bombed because it was the easiest target. We've been bombing Abu Kamal for years. Abu Kamal, our goal when we were supporting rebels who were taking on Bashar al-Assad was to cut off lines of communication between Syria and Iran so that supplies could not be brought in from Iran through northern Iraq, crossing the Syrian-Iraqi border and onto Damascus. Abu Kamal is the largest border crossing controlled by the Syrian government. It's an important border crossing because from the Syrian perspective, it not only allows Iran to provide supplies, but it also is a line of communication with the Iraqi government to allow for coordinated anti-ISIS operations. Israel has been attacking Abu Kamal. Donald Trump bombed Abu Kamal in December 2019, the same facility. And what happened here is that this was simply Biden saying, I need to make a statement. Someone said, bomb Abu Kamal, because it was the go-to target. And it's easiest for us to manufacture an excuse, but there's literally no grand strategy behind the picking of this target. This target was in the hip of the Pentagon. It's been a go-to target for many years, and it shows the intellectual laziness of the United States when it comes to dealing with the complexities that are part of the great Middle East puzzle that we're trying to solve. There is no grand thinking about Abu Kamal. It's been our go-to target for years because Israel wants to bomb it. We wrap it in this Iranian veneer that doesn't exist, and in this case, it wasn't on Iraqi soil. So that's pretty much.
That was basically the main thing. They just didn't want to offend Iraq in a way that Trump did, and yet they were all Iraqis that were killed. Like it's that type of stuff where it's like, dude, you killed all Iraqis. How's this sending a message to Iran? And sometimes the message in and of itself is the message. Meaning the very fact that you've invoked these people, that this was to go after, that from a standpoint of world politics becomes a message. Even though it wasn't Iranians, hardliners in Iran, we're going to eat that alive. I don't think this has been, without consequence. One last point, and this is 30 seconds. Could you explain Article 2? You mentioned it multiple times. You're talking about presidential, basically war powers, or the powers that are enumerated in the Constitution for defense, correct?
The article just means that the president basically assumes any powers and responsibilities not otherwise specifically handed out in the Constitution. And the way they've done war powers is, it used to be you'd think the president would have to go to Congress to use military force. That's what the Constitution's written. But Congress has allowed the definition of war to be diluted. This goes back to the time of Jefferson, when Jefferson took on the Barbary pirates. He avoided going to Congress. This isn't something a modern thing. This is a centuries-old problem with the Constitution, where we have powerful executives who feel they don't need to waste time and go to Congress to carry out actions that they deem are essential for the national security.
The voice that you guys have been listening to is Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and WMD whistleblower. You can find Scott on Twitter at @RealScottRitter. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Tomlinson Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking about the current political plight of Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York, who after, what is it, a month and a half now, after about a month ago, New York Attorney General Letitia James came out with a report stating that he had undercounted, his administration had undercounted deaths in and of nursing home residents by about 50%. That's thousands of people. And causing more deaths. The focus of her report was not on this, but part of the story is his administration had caused more deaths by taking nursing home residents, putting them in hospitals, and then pulling them back into the nursing homes before they'd fully recovered from COVID, where they would then, you can only reasonably assume, go on to spread the disease. You don't know exactly when people stop circulating this thing. Anyway, that was the story back then. His aide, in a private meeting with Democrat lawmakers, said that their administration froze because they were afraid of scrutiny from Trump's Justice Department. Cuomo had a meeting with Biden. Biden gave him hundreds of millions of dollars, didn't question him on this. That's what sets us up for the current political scandal, which is predominated and focuses on allegations that Cuomo has engaged in a lot of unwanted and kind of creepy behavior, sexual advances towards several former aides of his, and now a new woman who said that she met him at a wedding in September 2019, that he made an unwanted advance. They'd never met before. He put his hand on her lower back. He pulled her in. She removed his hand. He said that she was being aggressive. And he said that, I want to kiss you. And, apparently friends of hers, he said it loud enough that friends of hers overheard this. There's a picture of her looking extremely uncomfortable, kind of embarrassed, shocked, and angry at him while the event was ongoing. That's just the latest. There have been now 3 separate sets of allegations against Cuomo, alleging that he's engaged in a variety of unwanted sexual advances. And a lot of this stuff, 2 of these allegations specifically, have come out in just the past couple of days. Specifically, since we last had our current guest on, Michael Goodwin is joining us now. Michael Goodwin is a journalist and columnist at the New York Post. You can follow Michael on Twitter at mgoodwin_NYPost. And of course, you can read his articles at nypost.com. Michael, again, since we last had you, a bunch of new revelations have come out. What was already a pretty bad situation for Cuomo politically has turned worse quickly. What do you think about what's come out over the weekend, Michael?
Well, good morning. Look, as you rightly put it, it's getting worse by the day. And at some point, as I say, pick your metaphor. The dam is breaking, the walls are closing in, but there's no good news in this for the governor. And the other irony here is these 3 women have all accused him of this unwanted behavior and touching in 2 cases, and language in the 3rd, and 2 of them worked for him, and which of course is a no-no in the office. And so the Attorney General of New York is investigating this, is going to hire an outside law firm complete with subpoena power, and so the governor will have a lot to answer for. Meanwhile, the irony of this is that he was already under federal investigation for his attempt to hide the number of fatalities in New York nursing homes during the height of the pandemic. And this may ultimately, while the harassment charges are clearly a political problem for him, probably more than a legal problem, the FBI probe holds separately a real legal issue in that it's a criminal investigation. And whether he deliberately withheld not only from the public but from the FBI, from the Justice Department, which had requested documentation on the number of deaths in New York nursing homes. And there's no doubt that Cuomo withheld the information from the public and from the FBI. And we know now, because one of his top aides was recorded talking to the legislature, that the reason they withheld it from the public and the legislature was because they essentially were withholding it from the FBI.
And to make the point of how bad this was.
The information to be used against us, she said. Well, of course, that was the whole point of the FBI's, the Justice Department's original inquiry.
Yeah.
So these are really two big problems right now that the governor is facing.
To put it in perspective, nursing homes make up 1% of New York, and yet they were 28% of the fatalities. I mean, in 28%, we add in the new numbers, the unhid numbers, the numbers where the grandmas were pulled from the under the bed sheets or under the bed mattress. So from here on out, the politics of this. I mean, he was already, like you say, a federal investigation on issues of him basically hiding the number of deaths. But he was also under a local investigation by New York U.S. Attorney Latita James, where he wanted to choose the person who was going to investigate it, but even that became politically impossible. Meaning this person was all-powerful in New York is now stuck with the undignified position of giving over the investigation to somebody who clearly was a political enemy. Meaning she was the one that got that information out that he was hiding 50% of the deaths. And that is going to be the person that has to basically do the case. Like, what's the talk around this? I mean, that's big, especially if more women come out.
Yes, that's Letitia James is the New York State Attorney General, and she is the one who did a report on the nursing homes and found that the governor was undercounting by about 50%, she estimated. She did a sampling and came to that conclusion. They were political allies. The governor endorsed her early on in her attempt to become Attorney General, and so that was a big moment to her. But this has clearly now been a rupture in their relationship, and it is natural for her to be the Attorney General, to be the office that would investigate these sexual allegations, the sexual harassment allegations. I mean, that generally would not go first to a district attorney or something like that unless one of these employees went and filed a criminal case, which is more unlikely in this. It's unlikely a criminal matter so far. It's more likely just civil and therefore a matter of conduct and misconduct from a top public official. Look, I mean, put this in the context of, let's say, any corporation. Let's say the company that you guys work for, right? If one or both of you were accused of this kind of behavior, there would probably your company would investigate, or it might bring in an outside law firm so that there's no in-house conflicts of interest. And so that's effectively what's happened here is the governor tried to decide who would do the investigation, and Letitia James, rightly, along with a lot of legislators and members of the media, such as myself, said, oh, no, you don't get to pick who investigates you. You've forfeited that. Now, and then he continued to try to negotiate that for the better part of a day, offering up alternatives. Finally, Letitia James said, no, I make the decision, you don't. And so that was an important moment, I think, for the political implications here, because it clearly said, she was saying to him, look, whatever our political relationship was, that doesn't matter now. This is my job. This is my jurisdiction. Let go of it. And he did. Thankfully.
And the gloves are very clearly off. And we've so far left. There's just a lot to cover. We left two big things out here. One, he responded by flatly refusing physical advances and sort of half-quarter apologizing for what could be interpreted as insensitive comments. I'm paraphrasing him here, but that was effectively his non-apologetic apology. At the same time, what we haven't covered is a third track, which is, again, more political than legal, widespread allegations of his administration and him personally bullying, whether it's Assemblyman Ron Kim, who came out as a very prominent opponent who was criticizing Cuomo's policies on nursing homes, and then he he said that he received a call from Cuomo in which Cuomo was yelling at him, threatening his political career, left his wife shaken, fearing for their family's future with him as a politician. At the same time, or really a couple of days later, Lindsay Nielsen, who's a local investigative journalist in New York, says that she was intimidated, bullied, personally attacked by Cuomo's administration when she was doing critical reporting. So I just want to throw in here, we have already, like you're saying, there is a legal case that the FBI is pursuing against Cuomo's administration for his handling of the nursing homes and their cover-up, more importantly, I'd argue, of the data there, at least more relevant to the legal investigation. You have another political track, which are the sexual harassment and aggressive sexual behavior, these allegations against Cuomo. And you also have allegations more widely of political bullying and sort of, heavy-handed political manhandling of his subordinates and of the journalists, of the press in general. All of this stuff is setting him up for a quick fall. Do you think that this is going to come to impeachment? That's what people were talking about over the last couple of weeks. I haven't heard anything about that in the last couple of days, but with all of this stuff coming to a head like this, is it going to be the next election that he very likely gets pushed out, or is it going to be sooner than that? What are you hearing, Michael?
Well, that's a good way to frame it. Because the impeachment process in New York tracks the federal process. So you have the bicameral legislature, you have the Assembly and the Senate. The Assembly would need to take a majority vote to impeach on specific articles, and then the Senate would need to convict by a 2/3 vote. Now, Democrats have a veto-proof majority in both houses. There's no real Republican party to speak of in the New York State legislature right now. It's a very minor party. And so this is all about fellow Democrats. And so far, there has been, you mentioned Ron Kim, the assemblyman whom Cuomo threatened to destroy, allegedly. Kim is leading the impeachment effort. He's in the Assembly. So that's where it would have to start. Now, he's not having a lot of traction, I have to say, that there are handfuls, maybe 20, maybe 30 people, but there are 150 assembly members, so you need to get 76 of them to vote for impeachment. There are 63 senators, so you would need 2/3 of that for conviction. So I think impeachment is not yet on the immediate horizon, but that gets to the issue then, because the Letitia James report will not presumably, and there's no one to make the decision. She can't fire him. She can't remove him. Only impeachment. There's no real recall provision in New York. So it's really only impeachment or the next election. Those are the two remedies to get rid of a governor. And so impeachment might pick up steam with each new woman coming forward in this way, each new incident of his misbehavior coming forward. That might give more steam to the impeachment movement. And certainly whatever the Letitia James report comes up with, I mean, it's hard to see how her report would exonerate him of the charges we've already heard. I mean, they're pretty well documented, and so I don't think that he's going to find exoneration.
And presumably they're not the last. Michael, we've got to close this segment out. We're out of time. I want to thank you so much for joining us. This is a great segment, as was the last one. We look forward to having you back on soon. And I doubt he's going to resign. That's the other sort of tacit potential here, but I don't see him doing that. But still, the pressure is on. And again, we got at least 3 parallel tracks right now. All of these are going to continue to be stories, and we look forward to having you back on a little bit later to talk about them. For those listening, that was the voice of Michael Goodwin, journalist and columnist at the New York Post. You can follow him on Twitter at mgoodwin_NYPost, and you can read his articles at nypost.com. We're going into a break. We'll be back on the other side of this break, taking your calls in our wrap segment, 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And this is our last 15 minutes. We're wrapping up the show today. That means it's time for you to call in. If you want to join us, the phone number is 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. We've got 3 callers on the line, but room for more. Again, 202-521-1320. We've got Will calling in from Chicago. Will, you're on the line. By the way, we did not get to you yesterday. I remember you. You were the last one to call in, and I forget exactly what it was, but we got into an extended conversation, I think, with Ted Roth. No, it wasn't Ted Roth. For the last couple of minutes anyway. Steve Grumbine.
Yeah.
We were talking.
No worries.
We didn't get to you.
No.
I'm sorry about that. You're on. What's going on, man?
No. How's it going, guys? No worries. This is more of like a public service announcement. Please be aware there's a hunger strike going on nearly a month in Chicago after a known polluter, General Iron, who were forced to shut down operations in affluent Lincoln Park neighborhood for poisoning residents with particulate matter, unplanned explosion, among other environmental infractions. Didn't cease operations entirely, but have rebranded, acquired permits in record time, and are rebuilding their metal shredding factory in a poor black Southeast Side community half a block from school. Despite the dedicated posters using hashtag Twitter and Instagram, Shy Hunger Strike, Stop General Iron and Deny the Permit, which is the only demand by strikers, and which, Lori Lightfoot could accomplish with a wave of her pen. Despite TV appearances by strikers, Twitter storms and demonstrations by small but highly dedicated activists and community members, the mayor of Chicago is dead set on ignoring strikers and has not made a public statement. A prominent intellectual. I mean, you guys. I just want to get a signal boosted by you guys. So thanks for the time.
Appreciate it.
That is unconscionable. That is unconscionable.
What's that?
Meaning, what is taking place in Chicago? I mean, keep in mind, this is not this is not the only thing that Chicago deals with. You have the high crime rate. You have all of these people being killed. You have Rahm Emanuel finding that was lead in the water and then blows it off and hides the evidence, buries the evidence of it. And then it's like, so you have this question of like, how does this affect the kids that are growing up there? How does that affect the people that are there? And is it possible that it's deleterious to those people being human beings? And the answer, of course, is yes. And so it's like Lori Lightfoot, Democrat, supposedly, or yeah, she is a Democrat, is being pressured on this issue of like, look, your community needs you to protect the community. And she is mum. Whether this was the teachers returning back to school, whether this was the lead in the water, or whether it's this particular issue, she seems to be out to lunch. Am I wrong on this?
No. And here's all I want to say about it. I would like to cover this story more. I want to give you a bigger signal boost. This is a big story that we should be talking about. Will, my personal email address is shanestranahan@gmail.com. We also have faultlinesradio@gmail.com. If you have any contacts, I'm guessing that you're involved in some way. I know that you live there. You probably know folks. If you know anybody who could be a spokesperson for what's going on there, we'd love to have them on the show. That's at least my take. I'm pretty sure, Jamarl, you'd be down for that too. Just a 15-minute segment. We'd like to cover this issue a bit more because that is a big deal. I haven't heard about it on the national media, and frankly, it should be a bigger deal than it is because that's a travesty after everything that Chicago has already gone through and continues to go through. But yeah, shanestranahan@gmail.com would be good if you want to, please, I don't want to ask too much, but if you want to send along, figure out who'd be a good person to have on to talk about this. I'd love to have them on the show.
So here are the basics.
Thank you for the call.
Hunger strike on Chicago Southeast Side have gone on for nearly 4 weeks without food to protest environmental racism. And now the city is beginning to reconsider its stance on the controversial metal shredder that started it all. So yeah, this is the story. And yeah, you're right, Shane. I hadn't heard it. So this should have been had far more recognition. Chicago's a major city. So.
And this sounds like a major deal.
Yeah.
We got more callers, and we're taking more calls. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Thanks for the call, Will. We've got Ross calling in from Maryland. Ross, you're on the line. What's going on?
Hey, Jamarl and Shane, I wanted to touch on a few interesting trends that I am kind of observing in progressive online independent media. I supported forced the vote on Medicare for all. However, I think the message could have been delivered better. I like Jimmy. I think my issue was not his tone. I think it was the issue was he seemed to be determined to burn every bridge. And I understand his frustration and anger. It is our frustration as Americans. but I don't think he had to go so viciously after Cenk, who I'm not a big fan of, and others. I want to praise Jamarl for being one of the few people who changed my mind on impeachment. I was falling for the cynical trap set by much of the progressive media that just said, well, the Democrats are bad and the working class is angry, so the attempted insurrection was really just a joke and somehow to be brushed aside. Now, I do not have TDS. I actually voted for Trump in 2016, not 2020, and I opposed the censorship fallout from the 6th. But when the evidence came out that Trump not only gave that speech egging on people, but that he watched in glee and what he said to Kevin McCarthy about the election, I had to support the conviction. Like, you know, I agree with Jamarl. We can walk and chew gum. We can agree impeachment was correct. The Democrats are trash. And don't give me this crap about election integrity. Trump was also behind in Ohio and Texas and came back to win those states. It's time to get over 2020. Also, in other conspiracy news, there's this small but popular libertarian segment of progressive media starting to get into the weeds of anti-vax and COVID denialism. I'm very depressed to see that. And finally, my last point, many leftists say they want to work with the right. And I'm all for that if you mean common economic ground with average Trump supporters. But the wave of interviews progressives did with that Magnus fellow struck me as terribly naive and refusing to ask hard questions and wishing to being an alliance that does not really exist. It takes hard work to build working class alliances. You cannot just declare one exists. My issue is not the interview itself, but the way it was done. It's easy for me to say, but nobody wants to really do the work, guys.
Ross, man, I love this call because I've been saying the same thing about the left. It looks bizarre to me. I mean, you have people who it seems like all of the energy that should have went into Medicare for all and $15 an hour and all these other things that the public basically agreed with ends up being, stopped. It's almost like if you were with a very attractive woman and then she's like, yeah, now I'm going home. It was that. And so it's like, where does that energy go? And that energy, unfortunately, has gone into very bad places. I agree with you. I was forced to vote. I didn't like the way it was presented, and I didn't like the disingenuous way that it was put. It just seems like the goal was basically, Dorr was out of the party, joined with the People's Party thing, and he was trying to torch it all. He was like, well, I'm not part of that anymore, so I'm just going to destroy it all. And so people who would have been necessary to affect political will, meaning whether it was Medicare for all, whether it was any of these policies, get burned and attacked. And the left ends up with this kind of cult of basically attacking these guys relentlessly in ways that seem to go beyond the pale. And I agree with you across the board. The left has started to look very weird, very bizarre. And a lot of the stuff I don't quite get, and a lot of stuff I don't agree with. So Ross, thank you for the call. The point is, you can do both. You can have an opinion of Democrats that say these guys suck, while also going in and out of the political party structure on the things that you agree with and things you disagree with. That's kind of the point of being on the moon. You could say, yes, they're right with that. No, they're wrong with that. And you could be perfectly okay, providing there's some level of consistency within the context of the positions. Ross, thank you for that call. Shane, do you have anything to say about that, or you want to move to Tarif?
We got time for, we definitely have enough time for Tarif. We might have enough time for one call after that, 202-521-1320. I will try to be brief. On impeachment, I think both the Democrats and the Republicans have overplayed their hand. The Democrats, and here's what I actually want to focus on is what we are unfortunately set up for is a bifurcated future history where each party is going to have its own narrative that would disqualify the other party. The Democrats will blame Republicans for blocking an impeachment and allowing Trump to retain office if he runs again in 2024. And the narrative in 2024 is going to be politically, the Republicans prevented them from doing what they should have been able to do, which is keep this president who just incited a near coup from taking office. And that will be their narrative. Meanwhile, the Republican narrative will be that the Democrats stole the election in 2020. There was election fraud, rampant election fraud. And I'm sure they'll reiterate all those claims again in 2024 if it comes to pass that Trump or whichever Republican candidate runs in 2024, likely Trump, doesn't get elected. And so into perpetuity, until there is a reconciliation, which at this point to me seems impossible, you're going to have the parties ever more at each other's necks over these issues, which I just want to point out is unfortunate. But we've got Tarif calling in.
And by the way, I'm going to give it back to you, but I don't see an inflection point either. I don't see a point where the lines cross, where this goes in the opposite direction. But please continue.
I agree. Let's go to Tarif, calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's going on?
Good morning, gentlemen. Thanks for taking my call. First and foremost, free Junior and Science dropped the charges. my other comments is dealing with the Yemen crisis. Everybody constantly talk about Khashoggi, but you got 2 million children facing starvation because of the embargo might prepare you put on that country. These children, that would be genocide. 2 million innocent lives, and also the rest of the population's at stake because food is not going out because of war going on, and also the opening up an investigation on that governor of Michigan, Whitmer, because of something dealing with the nursing homes, similar to what happened in New York under Cuomo. It happened underneath her too, dealing with the nursing.
It's true. We had Tarif. I don't mean to cut into agreed on Yemen and agreed on Julian Assange. We got one more caller I want to make sure we get to, but we had Anthony calling in from Detroit talking to us about exactly that, how Governor Whitmer basically gave incentives that incentivized nursing homes bringing back people from the hospitals, which would get more people sick, more elderly people sick, leave them to die. And she basically demurred when it comes to blame. She said, well, we didn't order them to take them back. Well, that's beside the point. But Tarif, thank you for bringing that up. We got Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you're on the line. What's going on?
Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm going to go ahead and agree with you, Shane. And the caller before, Tarif, was going to just totally disagree with. There is no left. There is no right, man. We're just being – there is one empire, and we're all being sponged up by these people. And until we get that, we're just going to continue to go through the same circle and the same headache and the same complaints and the same debates and the same pontificating until we start understanding that we are human resources. And until we start taking action and stop just crying, we'll continue to go through it. How are you going to infiltrate the Democratic Party and change the Democratic Party when the Democratic Party was designed to do what by the people who pay them? It's ridiculous. Love this show as always, and you guys have a good day.
Thank you for the call. I'm sorry to cut you, man, but we're out of time. But thank you for the call. Agreed, in large part. We got to close it out. We'll be back tomorrow, folks. You've been listening to another edition of Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. See you again tomorrow morning.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Another one is in the record books. I want to thank all of you again for joining us for the show. Let's see. Google is doing very weird things. Where's my chat, Google? Where's my chat? All right. I'm going to end this. We have comments. All right. So let's go to the comments. Give me 1 second. Now, today was a good show. A very interesting show. I love it when I get to push back on somebody, especially people who are on the left. Actually, I don't know where Scott falls on that, but it was not my point of view that this stuff was okay. Like, just because a person takes a point of view that this is legal doesn't in fact entirely make it legal. The thing is, his point is, we've done this for so long that almost by definition it becomes illegal. Trudy, those who are saying raising the minimum wage causes inflation should call for wage freezes, or at least turn down raises, or shut the fuck up. But with that selfishness, Trudy, yes, you're right. Because they make the argument that, hey, if you drop all of that money into the bottom, the money that is spent by the people on the various things that they spend that money on will cause an increase in demand. And that increase in demand will, by definition, create an increase in prices, making the money that is given level off. Nonsense. If you want to, you could increase taxes on the wealthy in order to compensate. And I got to be honest, the American public at this point is so beaten down that the money that you give them, I have a hard time believing that inflation will basically overwhelm that amount. You're not giving them so much that they're all of a sudden going to be balling with $20,000 each. That's not where we are. I have a hard time believing that the inflation is ever going to be that pernicious that it would cause an issue. So yeah, Trudy, I agree with you on that. I don't believe the minimum wage increase is going to increase inflation. Those people are going to have more money in their pockets, more money to spend, and businesses are going to get more business. And when people, if there's some smaller businesses, or if there are businesses that have issue paying the $15 an hour and lay off 1 or 2 people, well, when those people get a job, that job is going to be paying $15 an hour. I also make the point that the government should have a jobs program, or at the very least, putting out something that can be so big and so prolific in its size that it would need a huge amount of workers to do where you could get this kind of governmental work program by default or by de facto. Yeah, hell yeah, you should do that. My point is, if you're Joe Biden and you know that the guys just had a failed putsch attempt, and you also recognize that the failed putsch attempt, they don't see it as being wrong. And on top of not seeing it as being wrong, they're the ones that are basically going to take the party. Then do you have a larger responsibility or not? And do you even recognize the fact that there's a larger responsibility with you in that particular role, that as the president, your job at this point goes beyond just the typical party politics that takes place. It goes into solidifying a situation where Democrats can pull people to their side in a way that keeps the monster from coming into the door. My point is, at this point, you basically have fascists in the Republican Party that are looking at that party as a way of taking power. And they've already shown that the moment that they take power, they're not giving it up. I can go with you with the idea that Democrats are trash. 1,000%, fair enough. I can even go with you that the way they attacked Trump with the Russiagate thing is also delegitimizing the president. Yes, 1,000%. I think I've argued as much that was their time point and doing it. Throwing over the table is different. And if the other party doesn't recognize that throwing over the table is problematic, then yeah, I have qualms with that other party getting into power. And I have greater qualms with Joe Biden going with the same methodology that they'll force the vote from you because the other people are so bad. And I'm telling you, if you lose the Senate and you start to lose the House, you're going to be eaten alive when it comes around for the main election. And that's assuming you even have the power to run. The only way out is to blow the roof off. You have 500,000 people dead. How is that not incentive for you to do miraculous fucking things? How is that not incentive for you to get on your bully pulpit and scream at the height of your lungs that you're the avatar of American force? You're going to defend Americans from inside, or from enemies on the inside. In the same way that FDR gave that speech talking about the moneyed interests and saying that the moneyed interests, thought that the United States had become just an appendage to their ends. That's the type of person, that's the speech that needs to be made, not this nonsense about partisanship. The point is never, or not, the point is not about partisanship. The point is to be an effective person for the American public, no more, no less. If the public is on board for $15 an hour, make it happen. Do your job. Is it within your powers to make it happen? And if the answer is yes, you better do it. The $2,000 that you promised, you should have made that happen. $50K, 500,000 people have died, have lost their lives. And we're quibbling, honestly, about $600. 500,000 Americans have lost their lives. They have vanished off the face of the earth. And this wasn't an act of God. You can make an argument that the virus was. But how we responded to it was just deplorable. And it caused all of those deaths. And when I make the case that the United States owes its public reparations, I'm talking about the entirety of the public. In the same way that FDR understood that when he took office, the only person or the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And having the conversation with the American public to create a relationship between the public and the president, to get around some of the political wrangling and everything else and speak to the public directly. Those were positive fucking things. And he could pull that off because he was working in the interests of that public. Joe Biden has that chance. He's been endowed with the power of the Senate and the House. They can get rid of the filibuster. They can ignore the parliamentarian. They have all of these capabilities. And he, just like McConnell, putting up a false wall about impeaching Donald Trump, puts up a false wall in regards to whether or not he can get these things done. Sanders shouldn't have to fight by himself on this when Biden promised it. Just saying. I'm going to say like. I'm going to say share. I'm going to say subscribe. Yeah, I'll leave it here. Thanks all. I may be seeing you guys a little bit later.